Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On the 4th of November 1918, in the grey harbour city of Kiel, on Germany's own Baltic coast, a young sailor named Karl Artelt stood in front of several thousand of his own fellow sailors and dockworkers, assembled in a drill hall that had been built less than a decade earlier, to train exactly these same men for exactly the kind of obedient, disciplined naval service that had just, in the space of barely 4 days, come apart in his own two hands and read aloud a short list of demands: better food, an end to the war, the release of a handful of mutineers already under arrest in the naval prison a few streets away, and the immediate abdication of an emperor whose own name most of the men in that hall had been raised to consider unmentionable in anything but reverent tones. It is the kind of scene that never once appears on the ceremonial postage stamps or the formal court portraits any empire prefers to leave behind as its own last word on itself. A drill hall full of exhausted, mutinous sailors in a provincial port city, and it is precisely for that reason the scene this whole long night is going to keep returning to, because within one single week of that same afternoon in Kiel, a monarchy that had ruled the most powerful industrial nation on the European continent for 47 years, that commanded the largest standing army in the world, and that still, as recently as that same spring, had believed itself capable of winning a war against 3 great powers simultaneously, ceased to exist, not through any foreign army's final assault on Berlin, not through any single decisive battle lost on any single decisive day, but through its own capital city's own working people simply declining, over the course of about 120 hours, to keep pretending the emperor's authority still meant anything at all. We are not telling tonight the story of how that same empire first came to exist, an origin this channel has already walked through in full on another night, nor are we retelling at any length the 30-year contest of battleships and colonial slights and wounded royal pride that this channel has also already spent a long evening describing in careful and complete detail. The story of how a rising Germany and an established Britain circled each other for 3 decades before finally colliding in the summer of 1914. Tonight belongs to something considerably more compressed, and in its own way, considerably more intimate than either of those 2 much longer stories. The specific 9 months, from the first mutinous shout in a Kiel drill hall in November of 1918 to a new constitution finally signed into law in a small provincial theatre town the following August, during which the empire that had spent 4 years fighting the largest war the world had yet produced was actually, in the plainest and least metaphorical sense available, taken apart by its own people in its own streets, while its emperor sat 200 miles away at a military headquarters in occupied Belgium, receiving reports that arrived, by the final days, several full hours behind the events they were supposedly describing. Let it be said plainly, before this evening walks through the specifics of how any of it actually happened, what kind of story this is going to turn out to be, because a story about a revolution carries certain expectations, a story about kings and admirals generally does not, and this evening intends to meet some of those expectations and to disappoint others just as deliberately. This is not a story about a single decisive uprising that swept a corrupt old order away and replaced it cleanly with something better, and it is equally not a story about a stable, functioning empire brought down entirely by a handful of disloyal radicals working from the shadows, a version of events a great many aggrieved German nationalists would spend the following 2 decades insisting was the honest truth of what happened in that first week of November. It is instead a story about an empire that had already, in every practical sense, stopped functioning weeks before a single sailor in Kiel ever raised his own voice against it. An empire whose own generals had privately concluded the war was lost before the mutiny even began, and about the considerably messier and considerably more contested 9 months that followed, in which several genuinely different groups of Germans, moderate socialists who wanted an orderly parliamentary republic, radical socialists who wanted a genuine council-based revolution on the Russian model, and the old army officer corps who wanted, above nearly everything else, simply to survive the transition with its own institutional privileges intact, fought one another, sometimes with ballots and sometimes with rifles, over what exactly was going to replace the throne that had just, almost accidentally, been vacated. It is worth naming honestly just how much ground a story built this way actually has to cover, because the German Revolution did not arrive, run its course, and conclude in any single tidy season the way a shorter uprising elsewhere might have. Its own footprint runs from a mutiny in a Baltic naval base through a wave of workers' and soldiers' councils that swept, within a matter of days, across every major German city from Munich to Hamburg, through two rival proclamations shouted from two different Berlin balconies on the very same November afternoon, through a secret telephone call between a new chancellor and an old army general that would go on to shape German politics for the following 15 years, through a bloody January uprising in Berlin's own streets, and the murder of two of the revolution's own most famous names, through a National Assembly convened, quite deliberately, in a small provincial town rather than in the capital city still considered too dangerous to host it, through a new constitution built with real democratic idealism, and this evening we'll ask you to notice honestly, real structural weaknesses that would go on to matter considerably more than its own framers ever intended, and finally through a failed right-wing coup in the spring of 1920 that showed, with genuine and unsettling clarity, exactly how unfinished the whole revolutionary settlement actually remained, even after its own official business had long since been declared complete. Before we drift any further into tonight's long story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find something worth returning to here, because that is the only reason I would ever want you to ask it of yourself. This is still a small channel, sitting right around 1,000 subscribers as this particular story goes up, and if you feel like giving it a hand along the way toward its own considerably larger goal of 10,000, there is no better time than tonight to do it, since every single one of you watching this is, in a very real sense, this channel's own equivalent of that first small crowd in a Kiel drill hall, a handful of people whose quiet decision to show up ends up mattering rather more than it might seem to at the time. If you are watching this on YouTube, you will find the Spotify link for this channel waiting for you down in the description, since these stories go up there as well these days, sometimes earlier than they reach this same screen, and if you are listening on Spotify right now instead, all you need to do is search Historian at Midnight on YouTube to find the rest of what this channel has been building. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. It costs you nothing, and it helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this same quiet corner of the internet. And there is something genuinely comforting about knowing that somewhere out there tonight, under a completely different stretch of sky, a stranger is easing into this same slow, unhurried telling of an old and complicated story. There is no need to rush towards sleep tonight, and no particular need to rush through what follows either. So let yourself sink a little further into whatever is currently holding you up. A mattress, a couch, the arm of a chair you never quite meant to still be sitting in at this hour, and let your own breathing find whatever slower rhythm it wants to settle into, without any real effort on your part. Dim the light if it is not already dim, or simply let your eyes soften and blur if the dark has already arrived on its own, because nothing in the story ahead depends on being watched closely, only on being heard. The way you might half hear a conversation happening in another room of a house you already feel safe inside, and let yourself drift, at whatever pace your own tired body prefers, into the story of a mutiny that started over fish and cabbage rations in a Baltic port, and of the 9 strange, contested, and genuinely consequential months that followed it, a war the generals had already quietly given up on. To understand why several thousand exhausted sailors refusing an order in a provincial drill hall could bring down an entire empire within a single week, it helps to start considerably further back than that same drill hall in the actual military situation Germany found itself in the autumn of 1918. Because the mutiny at Kiel did not create the empire's collapse, so much as it finally gave public visible shape to a collapse that had already been decided in private by the very generals whose own authority the emperor had spent the whole of the war deferring to almost without question. Germany's high command, led since 1916 by the formidable pairing of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his own considerably more operationally minded deputy, General Erich Ludendorff, had staked everything in the spring of 1918 on a final, massive offensive along the Western Front, a calculated gamble to win the war outright before the full weight of American manpower and American industrial production, only beginning to arrive in France in serious numbers, could tip the balance permanently against Germany, and that gamble, launched in March of 1918 with genuine early tactical success, that briefly reopened a war that had been frozen along nearly the same trench lines for 3 exhausting years, had by August of the same year run entirely out of momentum, out of fresh reserves, and out of the specific element of surprise that had made its own early weeks so effective, leaving German forces exhausted, badly depleted, and in a steadily accelerating retreat that Allied commanders, for the first time in the entire war, felt genuinely confident describing as the beginning of the war's actual end. It is worth naming plainly the specific date on which Germany's own military leadership privately abandoned any remaining hope of a negotiated victory, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that followed, and because it stands in genuinely stark contrast to the picture of a still fighting, still undefeated army that a great many German nationalists would spend the following 2 decades insisting had actually existed right up until civilians back home supposedly betrayed it. On the 29th of September 1918, Ludendorff himself, at a hastily convened meeting at German military headquarters, informed the assembled German government representatives, in a state several of those present described afterward as something close to genuine panic, that the front could no longer be held, that an armistice needed to be requested from the Allied powers within 24 hours if at all possible, and that Germany's own military situation had become, in his own chosen words, hopeless. A private admission made weeks before a single sailor at Kiel had refused a single order, and one Ludendorff himself would spend the whole of the rest of his own life conveniently declining to mention whenever he later found it politically useful to blame Germany's defeat on disloyalty at home, rather than on his own army's own battlefield exhaustion. It is hard not to notice how strange and how genuinely destabilising this same private admission actually was for the specific way Germany had been governed for the preceding 2 years, because Hindenburg and Ludendorff had, since 1916, exercised a degree of practical control over German civilian policy that went well beyond the ordinary authority any general staff might expect to hold even in wartime, arrangement historians have since come to call, with a certain dry precision, a silent dictatorship, in which an emperor increasingly withdrawn from day-to-day decision-making and a chancellor with progressively less real, independent authority both deferred, on questions ranging from military strategy to domestic food rationing to labour conscription, to 2 men who answered to no parliament, and who had, until that same September meeting, given the German public every reason to believe final victory remained not merely possible but close at hand. The same military command that had spent 2 years telling German civilians, through a tightly managed wartime press, that the war was winnable now turned, within days of privately concluding the opposite, to demanding that Germany's political system itself be hastily reorganised to shift the blame and the diplomatic burden of an armistice request onto precisely the civilian and parliamentary figures that same command had spent the whole war marginalising, a manoeuvre historians have since identified as the deliberate origin point of the very stab-in-the-back myth that would go on to poison German politics for the following 15 years, since it meant, from its very first moment, handing the humiliating business of actually asking for peace to a newly empowered civilian government, while the army itself stepped back just far enough to later claim it had never actually been the one that lost. A prince nobody in Berlin fully trusted, asked to save an empire in 6 weeks. It is worth turning now to the specific and genuinely unenviable position into which this same manoeuvre placed Prince Max von Baden, a moderate, liberally inclined member of the German nobility who had spent much of the war quietly critical of its conduct and who was installed as German Chancellor on the 3rd of October 1918, at the direct urging of a high command eager to have precisely this kind of reform-minded figure available to request an armistice and absorb whatever domestic backlash followed, a position Max von Baden accepted with real personal reluctance and, by his own later account, a genuine sense of being handed a burning building with instructions to somehow make it look, to everyone watching, as though the fire had already been safely contained before he ever arrived. Max von Baden's own government formed with the participation for the first time in German imperial history of ministers drawn directly from the Social Democratic Party, the largest single party in the Reichstag, and one that had spent decades as an object of open suspicion and occasional outright repression under the very monarchy it was now being asked to help save, represented a genuine and rapid constitutional transformation on paper, shifting formal responsibility for government policy from the Emperor and his own appointed Chancellor toward a cabinet answerable, at least in principle, to the elected Reichstag, a change so significant that a number of contemporary observers described it, with a mixture of genuine hope and genuine disbelief, as a revolution from above, an attempt to grant just enough real democratic reform, just quickly enough, to head off the considerably more thorough and considerably less orderly revolution from below that Max von Baden and nearly everyone around him could already feel gathering in the exhausted, hungry cities behind the front. It is hard not to notice, though, exactly how badly that same calculated gamble misjudged both the timeline available and the actual mood of the German public by October of 1918, because the reforms Max von Baden's government pushed through in barely 3 weeks, subordinating the military high command to civilian oversight for the first time in the Empire's history, making future declarations of war and peace treaties subject to Reichstag approval, arrived after 4 years of mounting civilian hunger produced by the British blockade. This evening is not going to re-narrate in any detail tonight, after a wave of industrial strikes that had already shut down major German cities on more than one occasion earlier in the war, and after a German public that had been told, right up until the final possible moment, that victory remained within reach, had already begun to draw its own considerably darker conclusions about a government and a monarchy that had spent 4 years asking for extraordinary sacrifice while offering, in return, remarkably little honest information about how the war was actually going. Max von Baden's own peace note to President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, dispatched on the 4th of October, requesting an armistice on the basis of Wilson's own previously announced 14 points, set in motion a diplomatic exchange that would drag on for more than a month. Wilson's own responses growing progressively more insistent that any armistice would require not merely a change of government personnel in Berlin, but a genuine and durable transformation of Germany's own constitutional structure away from what Wilson's own notes explicitly called arbitrary power, an American demand that a great many German officials read, correctly, as requiring nothing less than an end to the monarchy itself in some meaningful form, even as neither Wilson nor Max von Baden, nor, for that matter, nearly anyone else involved in the exchange yet imagined that the actual mechanism of that same monarchy's ending would arrive not through any diplomatic negotiation at all, but through several thousand sailors in a Baltic port refusing within days to sail, and steel and cabbage, and a fleet nobody in Berlin actually wanted to risk anymore. It is worth turning now to the specific and, on its own surface, almost absurdly narrow military dispute that actually lit the fuse in Kiel, because the sailors' own initial grievance had comparatively little to do with grand questions of monarchy or democracy, and everything to do with a single, deeply resented order issued by a naval high command that a great many ordinary sailors had already come to regard after 4 years of watching that same fleet sit largely idle behind the British blockade. This channel's earlier evening on the Anglo-German rivalry has already described in careful detail as an institution considerably more interested in its own institutional pride than in the actual lives of the men serving inside it. In late October of 1918, with an armistice already under active negotiation, and Germany's own defeat already privately conceded by its own high command, the commanders of the German High Seas Fleet, without informing or consulting the new civilian government now nominally in charge of German policy, issued an order for the fleet to put to sea and engage the British Grand Fleet in one final, deliberately climactic battle, an operation its own architects described with a candour that reveals a great deal about the specific brand of institutional honour culture running through the German Naval Officer Corps, as intended to preserve the fleet's own reputation through a glorious death in action, rather than allow it to be surrendered intact under whatever peace terms the civilian government was already negotiating on the fleet's own behalf. It is hard not to notice exactly how transparently pointless this same operation appeared to the ordinary sailors actually being asked to carry it out, because by the closing days of October 1918 there existed no remaining strategic objective a final naval battle could plausibly achieve, no fresh territory it could win back, no meaningful improvement to Germany's own negotiating position it could conceivably produce. Only the specific and, to a great many exhausted, malnourished, and increasingly politically radicalised sailors, deeply unconvincing prospect of dying in the war's final days for the sake of an abstraction of institutional pride that belonged, as these same sailors understood with real and immediate clarity, considerably more to the admirals issuing the order than to the ordinary men who would actually have to sail into the guns carrying it out. Sailors aboard several battleships at anchor in Wilhelmshaven began refusing on the 29th of October to raise steam for the planned operation, extinguishing boiler fires and, in at least one documented instance, disabling essential machinery to physically prevent their own ships from being able to get underway at all. A quiet, largely unarmed act of collective refusal that naval commanders initially attempted to suppress through the arrest of a small number of sailors identified as ringleaders, a response that, rather than ending the unrest, transferred it, within days, to the considerably larger and considerably more consequential naval base at Kiel itself, where several thousand sailors and shipyard workers, learning of the Wilhelmshaven arrests and already primed by years of resentment over inadequate food, harsh discipline, and a widening class divide between an aristocratic officer corps and an increasingly working-class enlisted ranks, gathered on the 3rd of November in a mass demonstration demanding the immediate release of the arrested men. It is worth remembering plainly exactly what happened when that same demonstration met the small detachment of soldiers sent to disperse it, because the specific violence of that single afternoon converted what had, up to that point, remained a narrowly focused mutiny over a single military order into something considerably larger and considerably more dangerous to the whole of the imperial order. A young naval officer commanding a patrol sent to block the marching demonstrators ordered his own men to open fire when the crowd refused to disperse, killing several sailors and civilians in the street and wounding a considerably larger number. A shooting that, rather than restoring order as its own commanders had presumably intended, produced instead an immediate and furious escalation, sailors across the base breaking into weapons stores, arming themselves in turn, and within a matter of hours effectively seizing control of the naval base and the city of Kiel itself from an officer corps that found itself, almost overnight, with no reliable armed force still willing to actually enforce its own orders, a sailors' and workers' council invented on the spot by men who had never run anything larger than their own watch rotation. It is worth pausing here on the specific and genuinely improvised political structure the mutinous sailors of Kiel actually built in the space of little more than a single day, once it became clear that the base's own existing officer corps no longer commanded any meaningful authority. Because the shape that structure took would go on to define the whole of the following months in ways nobody in that drill hall on the 4th of November could have fully anticipated. Sailors and shipyard workers gathering in mass assembly and drawing, with a self-conscious awareness several participants later described in their own memoirs, on reports that had reached Germany over the preceding year of the workers' and soldiers' councils that had organised the Russian Revolution the year before, elected their own representatives to a Kiel Soldiers and Workers' Council, a body that, within hours of its own formation, issued a short list of demands: the release of all arrested mutineers, an end to arbitrary officer discipline, and crucially the immediate conclusion of peace and the abdication of the emperor, a demand that had, only days earlier, existed almost nowhere in respectable German political discourse outside a small radical fringe, and that now found itself being shouted with genuine conviction by several thousand armed sailors who had quite suddenly become the single most powerful political force in an entire German city. It is hard not to notice how completely unprepared the empire's own existing political and military establishment actually was for a challenge arriving in exactly this shape, because Germany's imperial constitution, built around an emperor answerable to no parliament, and a military establishment that had, as this evening has already described, spent the preceding 2 years operating with minimal civilian oversight, possessed no institutional mechanism whatsoever for actually negotiating with an armed council of mutinous sailors, and the government's initial response, dispatching the social democratic politician Gustav Noske, a man chosen specifically for his own credentials as a moderate, order-minded socialist trusted by both the government and, its architects hoped, by the mutineers themselves, to travel to Kiel and personally negotiate a settlement, produced a genuinely revealing outcome, since Noske arrived in Kiel on the 4th of November, intending to calm and disperse the mutiny, and instead found himself, within days, effectively co-opted into its own leadership, elected by the sailors themselves as the head of their own governing council, a role Noske accepted with the specific private intention he would later admit, of steering the movement toward moderate, orderly reform, rather than allowing it to develop into the considerably more radical revolution its own most committed participants had begun to imagine, the fire that would not stay in one harbour. It is worth turning now to the specific and genuinely startling speed with which the exact model of workers' and soldiers' councils invented in Kiel spread across nearly every major German city within a matter of days, because the pace of that spread reveals something important about just how thoroughly the accumulated exhaustion, hunger, and resentment of 4 years of war had already primed the whole of German society for exactly this kind of rapid, largely spontaneous political transformation, the moment a single successful example demonstrated that it could actually be done. Sailors returning from Kiel by train, carrying news of their own successful mutiny to every station along the route, found audiences of soldiers, dock workers, and industrial labourers in city after city who required, in the great majority of documented cases, remarkably little persuading to form councils of their own. Hamburg's own naval garrison and dock workers establishing a council on the 5th of November, Bremen and Cologne following within a day, and the pattern repeating with a consistency that startled contemporary observers on every side of the growing crisis. In Hanover, in Frankfurt, in Leipzig, and in dozens of smaller German towns across barely a single week, each new council, in the great majority of cases, formed through the same basic process of a mass assembly of soldiers and workers electing representatives on the spot, with remarkably little central coordination between one city's council and the next, beyond the shared example each new city had learned about from the last. Notice, honestly, the specific city whose own revolutionary transformation actually outpaced even Kiel's in both speed and in the particular political radicalism of its own outcome, because Munich's own experience in these same first days of November offers a genuinely striking preview of the deeper ideological fault line that was about to open across the whole of the revolution still unfolding. Kurt Eisner, a journalist and independent socialist politician who had spent much of the war in prison for his own outspoken opposition to it, led a mass demonstration through the streets of Munich on the evening of the 7th of November that grew, within hours and with almost no organised resistance from a Bavarian royal government that simply melted away in the face of it into a full seizure of power, Eisner himself proclaiming, from the Bavarian Parliament building that same night, the end of the 7-century-old Wittelsbach monarchy and the establishment of a Bavarian Republic, making Bavaria, astonishingly, the first German state to formally abolish its own ruling dynasty, 2 full days before anything comparable happened in Berlin itself, and doing so under the leadership of a man whose own considerably more radical political instincts, sympathetic to the specific council-based, directly democratic vision of revolution that Kiel's own sailors had also gestured toward, would go on to put Bavaria on a genuinely different and genuinely more turbulent political trajectory than nearly any other German state across the following 6 months. Berlin, waking up to find it no longer had a government it recognised. It is worth turning now to the capital itself, because everything this evening has so far described, happening in Kiel and in Munich, and in a dozen smaller cities in between, arrived in Berlin on the morning of the 9th of November 1918. Not as a distant rumour, but as several 100,000 workers simply walking out of the city's own factories and forming into marching columns that filled the streets leading toward the centre of government, a general strike called jointly, in an alliance forged only in the preceding several days out of genuine mutual mistrust, by both the mainstream Social Democratic Party, the same party whose own ministers already sat inside Prince Max von Baden's government, and the smaller, considerably more radical Independent Social Democratic Party that had split from it 2 years earlier, specifically over the mainstream party's own wartime support for continued military funding. Soldiers garrisoned in Berlin, ordered to help suppress the demonstration, instead did in the capital exactly what sailors in Kiel had already done 5 days earlier, refusing to fire on the marching crowds and in a great many documented instances tearing the imperial cockades from their own uniforms and joining the demonstrators outright, leaving Prince Max von Baden's government, by the middle of that same morning, with no reliable armed force anywhere in the capital still willing to enforce its own authority. Consider plainly the specific and genuinely frantic set of decisions Max von Baden made across the following several hours, because they capture, better than almost anything else this evening will describe, exactly how completely the old imperial order's own chain of command had already dissolved even before its most famous formal moment actually arrived. Max von Baden, in direct telephone contact with Wilhelm at German military headquarters at Spa in occupied Belgium, pressed the Emperor with increasing urgency across the morning to abdicate immediately, warning that only an unambiguous announcement of abdication could still, in his own rapidly narrowing judgment, prevent the revolution now unfolding in Berlin streets from tipping entirely into the hands of its own most radical elements. A warning Wilhelm, isolated at Spa and still clinging, by every account of those present with him that morning, to a genuine personal conviction that he might yet retain his own title as King of Prussia, even if he formally relinquished the imperial crown, met with a hesitation and a series of qualified partial responses that left Max von Baden by early afternoon facing a crowd already gathering outside the Chancellery, and a general strike already effectively in control of the capital, with no actual abdication document in hand at all. It is hard not to notice what Max von Baden then did, because the decision he made in the early afternoon of the 9th of November 1918, without any formal legal authority to make it, and without Wilhelm's own genuine consent, would go on to be remembered as one of the single most consequential unilateral acts of the entire revolution. At roughly noon, Max von Baden simply announced to the assembled press, on his own authority, and considerably ahead of any actual signed abdication, that the Emperor had decided to renounce the throne. A statement that was not, in the strictest technical sense, yet true at all, but that Max von Baden judged, correctly as it turned out, to be the only remaining tool available to him capable of denying the crowds gathering outside a genuine, undisputed symbol, around which the day's still uncertain outcome might otherwise have crystallized into something considerably more radical than the moderate orderly transition Max von Baden was still, right up to his own final hour in office, desperately trying to engineer. Having made that same announcement, and with no remaining constitutional basis for his own continued authority as Chancellor of an emperor, who had, at least in the eyes of the watching public, just ceased to reign, Max von Baden resigned within the hour and handed the chancellorship, entirely outside any formal process the imperial constitution actually provided for, to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the mainstream Social Democratic Party, and, until that same morning, merely one of several ministers inside Max von Baden's own cabinet. 2 balconies, 1 afternoon, and 2 entirely different countries being proclaimed from them within a span of about 2 hours. It is worth turning now to the single afternoon this whole evening is going to keep circling back to, because it captures, with a clarity no later summary of the revolution's causes and consequences can quite match, exactly how thoroughly contested the actual shape of the new Germany already was on the very day the old one formally ended. Philipp Scheidemann, one of Ebert's own closest colleagues within the Social Democratic Party, learned, in the early afternoon of the 9th of November, that Karl Liebknecht, the most prominent leader of the considerably more radical Spartacist movement that had grown, across the war years, out of the left wing of German socialism into an organised revolutionary faction, openly modelling itself on the Bolshevik example in Russia, was at that same moment preparing to address the crowds gathered outside the Berlin city palace and to proclaim, from its own balcony, a Soviet-style socialist republic built directly on the authority of the workers' and soldiers' councils, rather than on any parliamentary or constitutional basis at all. It is worth naming honestly exactly what Scheidemann did in response, because the decision he made in the following few minutes, taken entirely on his own initiative, and without consulting Ebert, who was at that moment inside the Reichstag building eating lunch, and who would later express genuine and lasting irritation at not having been asked first, shaped the formal character of the new German state before Ebert himself, its own actual leader, had any real chance to weigh in on the question at all. Scheidemann stepped out onto a window ledge of the Reichstag building, overlooking a crowd that had already gathered there in anticipation of exactly this kind of announcement, and declared, in a short and largely improvised speech, that the old and rotten monarchy had collapsed, that a German republic now existed, and that this new republic belonged not to any single revolutionary faction, but to the whole of the German people, a proclamation Scheidemann delivered with no actual constitutional authority to make it, no text prepared in advance, and, by his own later admission, a genuine private uncertainty about whether Ebert would even approve of what he had just announced on his colleague's behalf. It is hard not to notice how close, in both time and in physical distance, that same proclamation ran alongside Liebknecht's own, because barely 2 hours later, from the balcony of the Berlin city palace roughly a mile away, Liebknecht addressed a considerably larger and considerably more radicalized crowd, and proclaimed a free socialist republic of Germany, a considerably more explicit call for a Soviet-style revolutionary state built on the direct authority of the workers' and soldiers' councils rather than on any future parliamentary election, a second proclamation delivered within the same single afternoon, and describing in its own essential vision a fundamentally different country than the one Scheidemann had just announced from the Reichstag, and it is worth sitting, honestly, with what this same near-simultaneous double proclamation actually reveals, because it shows, better than any later constitutional debate could, that the German Republic was born already split, on its very first afternoon of existence, between 2 competing visions of what a revolution against an emperor was actually supposed to produce: a parliamentary democracy built on elections and a written constitution, or a genuinely new kind of workers' state built on the direct ongoing authority of the councils that had actually done the work of bringing the monarchy down in the first place. Word finally reaches a headquarters 200 miles behind the news, It is worth turning briefly to Wilhelm himself, at German military headquarters in Spa, because the specific way news of his own deposition actually reached him captures, with a certain bleak precision, exactly how completely he had already been overtaken by events. He still, by every account of his own advisers present that day, believed himself capable of somehow controlling. Wilhelm learned of Scheidemann's proclamation of the Republic, and of the fact that Max von Baden had already publicly announced his abdication hours before he himself had agreed to any such thing, largely through wire service reports reaching Spa well after the events themselves had already occurred, and spent much of that same afternoon in a state several of his own generals present described as genuine disbelief, still exploring, in conversation with his own military staff, the possibility of leading loyal troops back into Germany to personally suppress the revolution and reclaim his own throne by force, an option his own senior commanders, led by the same Hindenburg who had served him for the whole of the war, informed him with a directness several accounts describe as genuinely painful, for both men to deliver and to receive, was no longer available, since the army itself, exhausted, defeated, and now witnessing its own soldiers joining the revolution in city after city, could no longer be relied upon to fire on fellow Germans on the Emperor's own behalf. It is worth remembering, plainly, the specific and rather startling admission General Wilhelm Groener, Ludendorff's own successor as the army's effective quartermaster general, delivered to Wilhelm in person at Spa on that same evening, because it amounts to the single clearest formal statement from inside the officer corps itself of exactly how completely the old order's own foundation had already crumbled. Groener informed Wilhelm directly that the army no longer stood behind him as emperor, a statement Groener chose deliberately to phrase in terms of the army's loyalty to Wilhelm personally, rather than to the monarchy as an institution, a careful distinction that would go on, within 24 hours, to matter considerably more than it might have seemed to in the moment, and Wilhelm, faced with a unanimous judgment from the very military establishment he had spent 30 years cultivating, and, on matters of naval policy especially, personally obsessing over, finally agreed, in the early hours of the 10th of November, to cross the Dutch border into exile. A decision made not in Berlin, not before any crowd, and not even, in the most literal legal sense, through any document he had yet actually signed, since Wilhelm's own formal written abdication would not actually be produced and signed until the 28th of November, more than 2 weeks after Max von Baden had already announced it to the world, and more than 2 weeks after Wilhelm himself had already, in practice, ceased to rule anything at all. A telephone call that decided more about Germany's next 15 years than any speech from any balcony. It is worth turning now to the single conversation that did more than perhaps any other individual event in this whole story to determine the actual shape the new German Republic would eventually take, because it happened not in front of any crowd, and not through any public proclamation, but privately, by telephone, on the evening of the 10th of November 1918, between Friedrich Ebert, now installed as the head of a provisional government still deeply uncertain of its own authority, and Wilhelm Groener, the same general who had just delivered Wilhelm's own political death sentence at Spa the night before. Groener telephoned Ebert directly and offered, on behalf of the army's own officer corps, an arrangement that would come to be known, in the decades of historical analysis that followed, simply as the Ebert-Groener Pact, the army agreeing to support Ebert's own provisional government and to help it maintain order against what Groener and his fellow officers regarded as the genuine threat of a Bolshevik-style revolution spreading out from its most radical strongholds in exchange for Ebert's own government leaving the army's existing officer corps, its existing command structure, and its existing internal discipline essentially untouched and unreformed. It is hard not to notice exactly what that same bargain actually meant, weighed honestly from both directions, because it is a decision historians have argued over with real and lasting intensity ever since. From Ebert's own perspective, a committed parliamentary socialist who had spent his entire political career working within existing legal and constitutional structures, rather than seeking to overturn them by force, and who genuinely feared, with real and not entirely unfounded justification, that Germany stood at real risk of sliding into exactly the kind of prolonged civil war and economic collapse that was, at that very same moment, consuming revolutionary Russia. The pact with Groener offered the one thing his own fragile provisional government otherwise almost entirely lacked: a functioning, disciplined military force capable of maintaining basic order while a new constitutional settlement was actually negotiated. From the perspective of the revolution's own more radical participants, and from the perspective of a great many historians writing in the decades since, the same pact represented something considerably closer to a betrayal. A moderate socialist government having come to power on the back of a genuine popular uprising against an authoritarian monarchy, immediately turning around and preserving intact the very officer corps, the very Prussian military aristocracy that had served that same monarchy loyally for the whole of the preceding war, a decision that left the new German Republic's most powerful instrument of physical force in the hands of men who had never actually accepted the Republic's own legitimacy, and who would, within little more than a decade, help deliver that same Republic into the hands of a movement considerably more dangerous than anything the Spartacists had ever represented. 6 men, 3 from each side, trying to govern a country that had just fired everyone who used to run it. Notice, plainly, the specific and rather awkward governing body that actually held formal power in Germany across the 6 weeks immediately following the 9th of November, because its own internal structure reveals, in miniature, the exact ideological split this evening has already described opening on the afternoon of the 2 balconies. The Council of People's Deputies, formed within days of the revolution as the provisional executive authority of the new German Republic, consisted of 6 members split evenly, 3 from Ebert's own mainstream Social Democratic Party, and 3 from the more radical independent Social Democrats, whose own support Ebert needed in order to claim, with any real credibility, that his government spoke for the whole of the revolutionary movement rather than merely for its more cautious wing. An uneasy power-sharing arrangement between 2 factions that agreed on remarkably little, beyond the shared and urgent necessity of feeding a hungry, demobilising country through the coming winter, and that spent the whole of their brief joint tenure in office locked in an increasingly open disagreement over the single most consequential question the revolution had yet to actually answer: whether Germany's political future should be decided by a freely elected National Assembly, the outcome Ebert and the mainstream socialists wanted, or by a continuing system of workers' and soldiers' councils exercising direct political authority in the manner the revolution's own more radical participants had spent the preceding weeks building on the ground in city after city. A Congress of Councils votes by a considerable majority to make itself unnecessary. It is worth turning now to the specific meeting at which that same foundational question was actually settled, because its own outcome surprised a great many of the revolution's own most committed radical participants, and did more than any single subsequent event to determine that Germany's revolution would ultimately produce a parliamentary republic rather than anything resembling the Russian model. Between the 16th and the 21st of December 1918, delegates elected by workers' and soldiers' councils from across the whole of Germany gathered in Berlin for a General Congress of Councils, a body that represented on paper exactly the kind of direct revolutionary authority the Spartacists and other radical socialists had spent the preceding 6 weeks arguing ought to become the permanent foundation of the new German state, and that instead, in a vote its own more radical delegates received with genuine shock and lasting bitterness, decided by an overwhelming majority, several hundred votes to a small handful, to hand its own supreme authority over to elections for a National Assembly to be held the following month, effectively voting itself out of any permanent governing role at all. It is hard not to notice how thoroughly that same outcome reflected the actual political composition of the councils themselves rather than any manipulation from above, because the great majority of delegates elected to sit in that Congress, drawn from ordinary soldiers and factory workers across the whole of Germany, rather than from the considerably smaller and considerably more ideologically committed circle of professional revolutionaries clustered in Berlin, turned out to hold political views considerably closer to Ebert's own moderate socialism than to Liebknecht's revolutionary vision, a great many of them having joined their own local councils in the first place, not out of any deep commitment to a permanent Soviet-style political system, but simply as the most immediately available vehicle for demanding an end to the war, better food, and the Emperor's own removal, three demands the revolution had already, by the time the Congress actually convened, substantially achieved. The Congress did vote to place the Army's officer corps under the nominal authority of the councils, and to press for a range of further social and economic reforms, but its own central and by far most consequential decision to schedule National Assembly elections for the 19th of January 1919 effectively closed off, within barely 6 weeks of the revolution's own opening mutiny, the specific alternative revolutionary path the Spartacists and their allies had hoped to build, a defeat those same radical socialists experienced as considerably more devastating, in the long run, than any single subsequent street battle, because it meant that the very institution built directly out of the revolution's own grassroots energy had chosen, through its own internal democratic process, to hand power to precisely the kind of parliamentary system the radicals had hoped the revolution would replace. A Christmas in Berlin spent trading rifle fire over unpaid wages. It is worth turning now to the specific and genuinely violent crisis that erupted in Berlin in the days immediately following that same Congress, because it marks the point at which the uneasy power-sharing arrangement between Ebert's moderates and the independent socialists inside the Council of People's Deputies finally broke down entirely, and because it demonstrates, with an intimacy the later January uprising would repeat at considerably larger scale, exactly how quickly the new republic's own governing coalition was prepared to call in armed force against the very sailors and soldiers who had made the revolution possible in the first place. The People's Naval Division, a unit of several hundred sailors who had come from Kiel to Berlin in the revolution's earliest days specifically to help guard the new government, and who had, by December, grown resentful over unpaid wages and increasingly suspicious of Ebert's own intentions toward the councils more broadly, occupied the Berlin City Palace and the nearby royal stables in a dispute that began, in its most immediate and least ideological form, as a simple demand to actually be paid the money the government already owed them. Ebert, persuaded by advisers within his own government that the sailors' occupation represented a genuine threat to the provisional government's own authority, authorised, on the 23rd and 24th of December 1918, an assault on the sailors' positions by regular army troops still loyal to the officer corps under the Ebert-Groener Pact this evening as already described, an operation that opened with an artillery bombardment of the royal palace in the very heart of Berlin on Christmas Eve itself, and that produced, after several hours of confused and increasingly costly street fighting, a considerably more humiliating outcome for the government than its own planners had anticipated, since a large crowd of ordinary Berlin residents, alarmed by the shelling of a landmark building on Christmas Eve and broadly sympathetic to sailors widely seen as having simply not yet been paid what they were owed, gathered around the fighting in numbers large enough that the attacking troops eventually withdrew without having actually dislodged the sailors from their own positions at all, a battle that killed a small number of soldiers and sailors on both sides, and that left Ebert's own government looking, to a considerable portion of the Berlin public watching it unfold, less like the defender of order it had wanted to appear, and more like an authority willing to shell its own capital's most storied building on the holiest night of the German calendar over what had begun as a dispute about back pay. It is hard not to notice what that same battle actually cost Ebert's government politically, because the independent socialist ministers still serving alongside him in the Council of People's Deputies, already deeply uneasy about the direction Ebert's own private arrangement with the army had begun to take, resigned from the government entirely within days of the Christmas fighting, protesting what they regarded as a betrayal of the revolution's own founding spirit, and left Eber's own mainstream socialists in sole formal control of the provisional government at the exact moment the country's revolutionary left, radicalized rather than pacified by the events of Christmas Eve, was preparing to organize itself into something considerably more coherent and considerably more confrontational than it had yet managed to become. A party born on New Year's Eve into a fight it was not actually ready to have. It is worth turning now to the specific and, in retrospect, genuinely fateful decision the German revolutionary left made in the last days of December 1918, because the organisational choice made in that single week would shape the character of the uprising still to come in ways its own participants did not fully anticipate at the time. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the two most prominent figures of the Spartacist movement, formally founded the Communist Party of Germany at a congress held in Berlin between the 30th of December 1918 and the 1st of January 1919, a new party explicitly modelled on the Bolshevik example, and committed in its own founding programme to the eventual establishment of a council-based socialist republic, rather than to participation in the parliamentary elections the council's congress had just voted to hold barely 3 weeks later. It is worth naming, honestly, that Luxemburg herself, whose own political writings had for years combined a genuine revolutionary commitment with a deep and consistently expressed suspicion of centralised undemocratic party structures, argued forcefully within the founding Congress against boycotting the National Assembly elections entirely, believing correctly as later events would demonstrate, that the new party lacked anything resembling the organised mass support it would actually need to seize power outright, and that a premature, poorly prepared uprising risked delivering the revolutionary left a defeat from which it might never fully recover, a warning her own younger and considerably more impatient comrades at the founding Congress voted down by an overwhelming margin, choosing instead to boycott the elections entirely, and to commit the newly formed party to a considerably more confrontational revolutionary strategy that Luxemburg herself, despite her own reservations, ultimately felt bound by party loyalty to support once the vote had actually gone against her: a dismissed police chief, a general strike nobody quite controlled, and a fight the Spartacists did not actually start. It is worth turning now to the specific spark that actually set off the January uprising this evening has been building toward, because the sequence of events reveals, with a clarity that later nationalist mythology would spend considerable energy obscuring, that the so-called Spartacist uprising began not as a carefully planned communist seizure of power, but as a considerably more improvised and considerably less centrally directed response to a single government personnel decision. Ebert's government, on the 4th of January 1919, dismissed Emil Eichhorn, the independent socialist police chief of Berlin who had been appointed during the revolution's earliest days, and who had, in the months since, become an increasingly visible symbol of the radical left's continued institutional foothold inside the capital, a dismissal Eichhorn refused to accept, and that prompted the independent socialists, the small communist party barely a week old, and a considerably larger and more loosely organised crowd of Berlin workers to call for a mass demonstration in his defence the following day. It is hard not to notice how quickly and how far beyond its own organisers' original intentions that same demonstration actually grew, because the 5th of January 1919 brought hundreds of thousands of Berlin workers into the streets, a crowd considerably larger than any of the specific political factions nominally leading it had actually expected or had any real organisational capacity to direct, and a small, more radical contingent within that same crowd, acting on their own initiative and without any clear authorisation from the wider leadership of either the independent socialists or the newly founded Communist Party, seized control of several newspaper offices and railway stations across central Berlin, an occupation that a hastily convened and genuinely divided revolutionary committee, meeting that same evening and including Liebknecht among its members, voted in a decision Luxemburg herself would later criticise as a serious tactical error, taken without any realistic assessment of the actual balance of armed force in the city, to escalate into a formal call for the overthrow of Ebert's government entirely, a declaration made despite the plain and rather inconvenient fact that the revolutionary left, for all the size of the crowd that had turned out that same afternoon, controlled nowhere near the organised, disciplined armed force such a declaration would actually require to succeed. Noski agrees to be the empire's last general, in a republic that had just abolished the emperor who used to appoint them. It is worth turning now to the specific and, in the very particular language its own architect used to describe it, genuinely chilling decision Ebert's government made in response to that same uprising, because it would go on to define Gustav Noska's own historical reputation for the remainder of his life. Ebert needing an armed force capable of retaking central Berlin from the scattered occupations of the preceding days, and having, under the terms of the Ebert-Groener Pact this evening has already described, an army officer corps willing in principle to provide exactly that force, turned specifically to Noski, the same moderate social democrat who had gone to Kiel 2 months earlier and been elected to lead the sailors' own council there, and asked him to take personal command of the operation to suppress the uprising, a request Noski accepted with a single sentence that has been quoted in nearly every serious history of the period written since, remarking that someone had to be the bloodhound, since he himself did not shy away from the responsibility. Consider plainly exactly what forces Noski actually assembled to carry out that same responsibility, because the specific composition of those forces matters enormously to understanding both the uprising's swift and bloody suppression and the considerably darker consequences that composition would go on to produce for German politics across the following 15 years. Noske drew, in addition to whatever regular army units remained available, heavily on a new and rapidly growing phenomenon known as the Freikorps, paramilitary volunteer units formed in the chaotic weeks immediately following the armistice by demobilised soldiers, many of them former officers who had lost both their wartime rank and their entire prior sense of social standing in the collapse of the old imperial order. Units that recruited specifically among veterans nursing a deep and often explicitly stated resentment toward the socialist revolution they blamed, with real bitterness, for having supposedly stabbed a still undefeated army in the back, and that brought to the suppression of the January uprising a level of ideological hostility towards socialism of any kind, and a willingness to use lethal force with considerably less restraint than any conventional army unit might have exercised, that would go on to shape the entire character of the fighting that followed, bloody weak, and a victory that cost the revolution's own moral authority to win it. It is worth remembering, honestly, exactly what those same Freikorps units and regular army troops actually did across the 6 days historians have since come to call Bloody Week, from roughly the 8th to the 13th of January 1919, because the suppression of the January uprising, while militarily decisive within days, was carried out with a level of violence, including the summary execution of captured or surrendering combatants, and, in a number of separately documented incidents, of unarmed civilians mistaken for participants, that shocked a considerable portion of the same Berlin public that had, only weeks earlier, watched government troops shell the royal palace on Christmas Eve, and that left, by the fighting's actual end, something in the range of 150 to 200 people dead across the city, the great majority of them workers and radical demonstrators, rather than the disciplined revolutionary army. The uprising's own more excitable early proclamations had implied Berlin was about to face. It is hard not to notice, in the fighting's immediate aftermath, exactly what happened to the two figures whose own names history would come to attach most closely to the whole of the January uprising, even though neither of them, in any meaningful organisational sense, had actually planned or directed it. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both of whom had gone into hiding in a working-class district of Berlin as government forces retook the city, were discovered and arrested by Freikorps soldiers on the 15th of January 1919 and taken separately to the Eden Hotel, which Freikorps units had established as their own temporary headquarters, where both were beaten with rifle butts by the soldiers escorting them before being taken out, again separately, for what their captors described afterward as transfer to prison. Liebknecht was shot on the pretext of an attempted escape a great many historians since have concluded was entirely fabricated in the Tiergarten Park in central Berlin, and his own unidentified body was subsequently delivered to a Berlin hospital as an unknown man killed by persons unknown, while Luxemburg was struck unconscious by a rifle butt to the head inside the hotel itself, shot afterward in the head by an officer named Hermann Souchon, and her own body was thrown from a bridge into the Landwehr Canal, where it would not actually be recovered and formally identified until the following May, more than 4 months after her own death, floating in the same stretch of Berlin Canal water for the whole of that intervening winter and spring, while a government that owed a considerable part of its own existence to the revolution she had helped build made no serious or sustained effort to actually locate her. It is worth naming plainly exactly what became of the men directly responsible for both killings, because the outcome of their own subsequent trials reveals, with real and lasting clarity, exactly how thoroughly the Ebert-Groener Pact's own bargain, army discipline left essentially untouched in exchange for the army's cooperation against the revolutionary left, had already begun to shape the young republic's own capacity to hold its most powerful institution genuinely accountable. A military tribunal convened later in 1919 to examine the killings produced convictions carrying only minor and largely symbolic punishments for a small handful of the soldiers directly involved, the officer who had ordered and helped carry out Liebknecht's own killing receiving a short prison sentence he did not, in the event, ever fully serve, having been assisted in escaping to the Netherlands before his own term was complete, an outcome that left both killings functionally unpunished in any meaningful sense, and that Eber's own government, whatever its own private discomfort with the outcome, did essentially nothing to seriously contest, a failure of accountability that would go on to convince a considerable portion of the German revolutionary left, for the whole of the Republic's remaining 14 years, that the Republic itself had been built, from its very first bloody weeks, on an unspoken alliance between moderate socialism and the same military and nationalist establishment the revolution had nominally overthrown. An election held 6 days after the bodies were still being counted, and women casting a ballot in Germany for the very first time. It is worth turning now to the specific vote the Council's Congress had already scheduled weeks before Bloody Week ever began, because the National Assembly elections held on the 19th of January 1919 arrived, in the most literal sense, while Berlin's own streets were still being swept clean of the preceding week's wreckage, and produced, on their own particular terms, a genuinely historic outcome quite apart from whatever government it eventually installed. German women voted in a national election for the first time in the country's history, a right granted by the provisional government within days of the revolution's own opening week, and one that brought roughly 10 million additional voters to the polls, women who turned out, according to the turnout figures preserved from the vote itself, in numbers essentially matching the participation rate of German men. A democratic expansion this evening is not going to let pass without naming plainly as one of the revolution's own genuine and lasting achievements, whatever else its own architects failed to deliver. Notice, too, exactly what the election's own results actually looked like, because they reveal, with real clarity, that the German public in January of 1919 wanted, overwhelmingly, precisely the moderate parliamentary republic Eber had been building toward, rather than the council-based revolution the Spartacists had just been crushed for attempting. Ebert's own Social Democratic Party won the largest single share of the vote, followed by the considerably more centrist Catholic Centre Party and the German Democratic Party, a new liberal party formed in the revolution's aftermath. The three parties together commanding a comfortable majority of seats and forming, within weeks, the coalition government that would go on to actually draft Germany's new constitution, while the independent socialists, still reeling from the January bloodshed, and the fledgling Communist Party, which had boycotted the election entirely on Luxembourg's own overruled objection, found themselves, between them, commanding barely a tenth of the new assembly's seats. a result that left the revolution's own more radical wing formally and decisively outvoted within barely 10 weeks of the mutiny at Kiel that had actually started the whole affair. A small theatre town chosen specifically because Berlin no longer felt safe enough to host its own founding assembly. Consider, plainly, the specific and rather telling decision to convene that same newly elected National Assembly, not in Berlin at all, but in the small provincial town of Weimar, a place known to the whole of educated Germany chiefly as the former home of the poets Goethe and Schiller, and as a byword for German literary and cultural refinement, rather than for anything resembling political power, because the choice was made almost entirely for practical reasons of physical safety, Berlin having just endured the violence of Bloody Week, and remaining, by every assessment of the government's own security advisers, considerably too volatile and considerably too exposed to further armed unrest to safely host a gathering of elected delegates from across the whole of the country. The National Assembly convened on the 6th of February 1919 in Weimar's own National Theatre, the very building where Goethe had once served as director, a setting a great many delegates and commentators at the time found genuinely poignant. A fragile new German democracy choosing to be born inside a temple of exactly the humane, cultured, cosmopolitan German identity that a great many of its own founders hoped might yet prove considerably more durable than the military and imperial identity the country had just spent 4 catastrophic years fighting a world war in the name of. It is worth naming, honestly, that this same choice of location, however practically sensible and however symbolically resonant at the time, would go on to lend its own name to the entire 14-year republic the Assembly was about to create, a republic that would be known to history simply as Weimar Germany, despite having conducted the overwhelming majority of its own actual governing business back in Berlin within a matter of months, a naming accident that has left generations of students since occasionally surprised to learn that the Weimar Republic's own capital was never in fact Weimar at all. Ebert becomes president of a country he helped talk out of becoming a monarchy, and immediately starts writing its rulebook. It is worth turning now to the specific business the assembled delegates actually accomplished at Weimar, because the National Assembly elected Friedrich Ebert on the 11th of February 1919 as the first president of the new German Republic, a considerable personal journey for a man who had begun his own working life as a saddler's apprentice, and who had spent decades building a career inside the very Social Democratic Party the old imperial establishment had once regarded as barely tolerable, and turned, almost immediately, to the considerably more difficult task of actually drafting a permanent constitution to replace the provisional arrangements that had governed Germany since the previous November. It is worth remembering plainly the specific legal scholar entrusted with drafting the great bulk of that same constitution's actual text, because Hugo Priess, a liberal constitutional lawyer whose own writings on democratic government had, for decades before the war, made him something of an outsider within a German legal profession still dominated by considerably more conservative, monarchist assumptions about the proper relationship between a state and its citizens, brought to the task a genuine and carefully considered commitment to building one of the most thoroughly democratic constitutional documents anywhere in the world at that time, a document that would establish universal suffrage for all German citizens over the age of 20 regardless of sex, a proportional representation electoral system designed to ensure that even smaller parties received a share of parliamentary seats genuinely proportional to their own actual vote share, an extensive bill of individual rights, and a federal structure that preserved a meaningful degree of self-government for Germany's individual states while still, for the first time in German history, subordinating them clearly to a single national democratic government, answerable to the whole of the German electorate rather than to any hereditary monarch. It is hard not to notice, though, examining that same constitution with the considerable benefit of everything historians have since learned about how it actually functioned in practice, exactly which of its own genuinely well-intentioned provisions would go on to create the specific structural weaknesses that would matter so much to the Republic's own later history, because Preuss's own proportional representation system, while genuinely democratic in its intention to represent even small minority viewpoints fairly, would go on to fragment the Reichstag across the following 14 years into a proliferating array of small parties that made stable, durable coalition governments extremely difficult to sustain. And because Article 48 of the same constitution, granting the President emergency powers to rule by decree and to suspend individual civil liberties during a declared national emergency, a provision Prues and his fellow drafters included with the entirely reasonable intention of giving the young republic a tool to defend itself against exactly the kind of armed uprising this evening as already described at Kiel and in Berlin's own January streets would go on, in a considerably darker irony this evening will return to before the night is through, to become one of the specific legal instruments through which German democracy would eventually be dismantled from within rather than defended, barely 14 years after Preuss first drafted the clause meant to protect it. The Constitution was formally adopted by the National Assembly on the 31st of July 1919 and signed into law by Eber himself on the 11th of August, a date that would go on to be celebrated for the whole of the Republic's remaining existence as a national holiday called Constitution Day, even as the Republic it had just created was already, by that same August, facing renewed armed challenges from directions its own framers had not fully anticipated. A second Bavarian Republic, considerably further to the left than the first one Eisner had built. It is worth turning now, briefly, back to Bavaria, because the state that had led the whole of Germany into revolution back in November found itself, in the spring of 1919, at the centre of the single most radical and most short-lived experiment in council-based socialist government the entire German Revolution actually produced. Kurt Eisner, the independent socialist who had proclaimed the Bavarian Republic back in November, was assassinated in Munich on the 21st of February 1919 by a young nationalist aristocrat named Anton Graf von Arco of Valley, on his own way to formally resign following a disappointing election result, a killing that plunged Bavaria's own already unstable political situation into a period of genuine chaos, and that helped set the stage, within weeks, for a considerably more radical faction of Bavaria's revolutionary left to declare, on the 7th of April 1919, a Bavarian Soviet Republic, a government built explicitly on the direct council-based model the Spartacists in Berlin had failed to establish and led, in its earliest and most genuinely idealistic phase, by a group of writers, poets and intellectuals whose own commitment to revolutionary theory considerably outpaced their own practical experience actually running a government. It is hard not to notice how quickly that same initial, almost accidentally poetic phase of the Bavarian Soviet Republic gave way to a considerably more organised and considerably more dangerous communist-led government within barely 2 weeks, nor how swiftly and how violently the response to it arrived, because Ebert's own national government, viewing an actual functioning Soviet Republic on German soil as an existential threat to the whole of the constitutional settlement it had just spent the preceding several months building at Weimar, dispatched a combined force of regular army troops and Freikorps units, considerably larger and considerably more heavily armed than the forces that had suppressed the January uprising in Berlin, to retake Munich by force, a campaign that culminated over the first days of May 1919 in several days of brutal urban fighting and a wave of summary executions of captured or suspected communists that killed, by the most careful estimates historians have since produced, well over 1,000 people, a death toll considerably higher than the Berlin uprising's own bloody January weeks had produced, and one that left Bavaria, for the whole of the following decade, home to a nationalist and anti-republican political culture considerably more entrenched and considerably more dangerous than almost anywhere else in Germany. Fertile ground, this evening will note without dwelling on it further tonight, for a small nationalist party then just beginning to organise in Munich's own beer halls under the leadership of a First World War veteran named Adolf Hitler. a treaty signed in the same mirrored hall an empire had once been proclaimed in, and a republic forced to accept the bill for a war it had not actually started or lost on its own terms. Notice honestly exactly how the settlement being negotiated at Paris across these same months landed on a German government that had, by the summer of 1919, only just finished drafting its own constitution and suppressing a Soviet republic in its own second city, because the timing mattered enormously to how the treaty's own harsh terms were actually received inside Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, presented to German representatives in May of 1919 on essentially a take-it-or-leave-it basis, and signed, finally, on the 28th of June 1919, stripped Germany of its overseas colonies, reduced its army to a token force of 100,000 men, required the return of Alsace and Lorraine to France, imposed a burden of financial reparations that would go on to dominate German politics for the following decade, and included, in its own Article 231, a formal assignment of exclusive war guilt to Germany that struck the great majority of ordinary Germans, this evening will name honestly, as a genuinely bitter humiliation delivered to precisely the wrong government, since it was Ebert's fledgling republic, not the imperial establishment that had actually made the decisions leading to war, that was now being asked to sign its name to the settlement and to accept, on the new democracy's own still untested shoulders, the full weight of blame for a catastrophe the Republic's own founders had spent the whole of the preceding several months trying to clean up rather than cause. It is worth naming plainly precisely why this same sequence of events did such lasting damage to the new Republic's own claim to legitimacy in the eyes of a considerable portion of the German public, because it produced, almost immediately, exactly the kind of dangerous conflation that would go on to poison German politics for the whole of the following decade and a half. Ordinary Germans who had genuinely little detailed understanding of the private military collapse this evening described at its very opening the September conversation in which Ludendorff himself privately conceded the war was lost weeks before a single sailor at Kiel ever mutinied, coming instead to associate the November Revolution and the humiliating peace that followed it as a single continuous act, a republic born in the resentful popular telling, specifically in order to surrender a war the army had never actually lost on the battlefield, a resentment that fed directly into the very stab-in-the-back myth this channel's own earlier evening on the Anglo-German naval rivalry has already described being cultivated, within months of the armistice, by the same Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who had privately admitted defeat in September of 1918, and who spent the whole of the rest of their own careers loudly insisting otherwise. A brigade the treaty itself had just outlawed marches on Berlin anyway. It is worth turning now to the specific episode that showed, with real and unsettling finality, exactly how unfinished the revolutionary settlement actually remained, even after a constitution had been signed and a peace treaty ratified, because the Kapp Putsch of March 1920 demonstrated that the same Freikorps units Noske had relied on to crush the revolutionary left in Berlin and in Munich had never, at any point, actually accepted the republic those same units had just finished defending on the government's own behalf. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to reduce its army to a maximum of 100,000 men, a limit that meant disbanding a great many of the Freikorps units that had done the actual fighting against the Spartacists and the Bavarian Soviet Republic. And when the government, in early March of 1920, ordered the dissolution of two such units based near Berlin, their commanders, a nationalist civil servant named Wolfgang Kapp and a Freikorps officer named Walter von Lüttwitz, responded not by disbanding, but by marching several thousand armed men directly into the capital, occupying the government quarter on the 13th of March 1920, and declaring Kapp himself the new Chancellor of Germany in a direct and openly announced attempt to overthrow the constitutional government Weimar had spent the preceding year building. Consider plainly exactly how Ebert's own government actually survived that same coup, because the specific method reveals something genuinely important about where real power in the young republic still actually resided less than a year after its own constitution had been signed. Ebert's government, fleeing Berlin first for Dresden and then for Stuttgart as the Freikorps units occupied the capital behind them, found the regular army's own senior leadership either openly sympathetic to the coup or, at best, unwilling to move against fellow former officers to defend a socialist-led government, a refusal that left the constitutional government with no reliable military force of its own to call on at the exact moment it needed one most, and forced Ebert and his own ministers to appeal instead directly to the same trade unions and working-class organisations that had powered the original November Revolution, issuing a call for a nationwide general strike that brought within days the great majority of German industry, transportation and public services to a complete standstill, a labour mobilisation so total and so effective that Kapp's own would-be government, unable to actually administer a country whose civil servants, railway workers and bank clerks had simply stopped showing up to work on his behalf, collapsed within 4 days, Kapp himself fleeing to Sweden and Lüttwitz, resigning his own command, a defeat of a right-wing coup, accomplished not by the army the Republic had spent its first year cultivating a careful alliance with, but by precisely the organised working class that same alliance had been built, in considerable part to keep in check. It is hard not to notice the genuinely bitter irony embedded in that same general strike's own aftermath, because workers in the industrial Ruhr Valley, having just demonstrated that their own collective action could defeat an armed right-wing coup the army itself had declined to resist, used that same momentum to form an armed workers' militia of their own, tens of thousands strong, that briefly seized control of much of the region in the immediate aftermath of the Kapp Putsch's collapse, only to find themselves within weeks facing exactly the same regular army and Freikorps units that had just failed to defend the constitutional government against Kapp turning around, with the government's own renewed authorization once the immediate coup threat had passed, to suppress the Ruhr uprising with a level of lethal force considerably disproportionate to the actual threat it posed, killing several thousand workers across a campaign that many of the same soldiers who'd refused to defend Ebert against Kapp prosecuted with real and evident enthusiasm once the target had shifted back to the political left, a sequence of events that left the revolutionary period's own final chapter, closing on a note of profound and rather telling asymmetry. An army willing to stand aside while the constitution was nearly overthrown from the right, and eager to act the moment the threat appeared to come from the left instead. Both hands held open at once on what this revolution actually was and was not. It is owed to you, before this evening turns toward its own close, to weigh honestly, in a single accounting, the genuine achievement and the genuine failure this 9-month revolution actually contained, because a story told from only one of those two hands would not be telling you the truth of it. Ebert and the mainstream Social Democrats who led the revolution's moderate wing deserve real credit for building, in remarkably difficult and genuinely dangerous circumstances, one of the most democratically progressive constitutions anywhere in the world at that time, extending the vote to women for the first time in German history, establishing genuine parliamentary accountability in place of an emperor answerable to nobody, and doing so while holding together a starving, demobilizing and deeply divided country that a great many contemporary observers, in Germany and abroad alike, genuinely expected to collapse into the kind of prolonged civil war then consuming Russia. An achievement this evening has no interest in minimizing simply because of everything that would eventually happen to the republic those same men built, and yet it is worth naming, plainly and without softening, exactly where that same genuine achievement came at a cost. Its own architects arguably did not have to pay in full, because the specific bargain Ebert struck with Groner, and the specific willingness with which Noske turned Freikorps units openly hostile to the Republic itself loose against the revolution's own left wing, purchased short-term order at the price of leaving the old Imperial officer Corps' institutional power almost entirely intact, a decision that left the Republic, for the whole of its 14-year existence, defended by an army whose own senior leadership had never accepted its legitimacy, and that would, in the Republic's final crisis a decade later, decline to defend it with anything like the energy it had shown in crushing Spartacists and Bavarian Soviets in 1919. It is worth remembering too that Rosa Luxemburg's own considerable political foresight, her warning against boycotting the National Assembly elections, her deep and prescient suspicion of centralised revolutionary violence divorced from genuine mass democratic support, went unheeded by her own younger comrades at the exact moment it might have mattered most, and that her own murder, along with Liebknecht's, deprived the German left of two of its own most serious and most independently minded thinkers, at precisely the moment German democracy would go on to need serious, independently minded thinkers on every side of its own political spectrum considerably more than it would ever again actually have them. Counting what 9 months of revolution actually cost, in lives nobody produced one single tidy number for. Nobody, in any single accounting this evening has been able to locate, has ever produced one clean, universally agreed figure for how many Germans actually died across the whole of the revolutionary period between November of 1918 and the suppression of the Ruhr uprising in the spring of 1920, and it is worth sitting with that same uncertainty honestly, rather than pretending a tidier arithmetic exists than actually does. The best modern estimates place the dead of Bloody Week in Berlin at somewhere between 150 and 200 people, the suppression of the Bavarian Soviet Republic at well over 1,000, and the crushing of the Ruhr uprising following the Kapp Putsch at several thousand more, figures that taken together suggest a revolution that killed, at an absolute minimum, somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 Germans in barely 18 months, the overwhelming majority of them workers, sailors and soldiers from precisely the classes whose own collective refusal to keep obeying orders had made the whole revolution possible in the first place, killed, in the great majority of documented cases, not by any foreign army, but by German Freikorps units recruited from among their own former wartime comrades, whose ledger this revolution was actually settled on. It is worth naming too, honestly, exactly whose lives this whole contest over Germany's political future was actually paid for with, because the men who negotiated the Ibert-Gröner Pact, who signed the Weimar Constitution, and who eventually defeated the Kapp Putsch through a general strike rather than through arms, were, in the great majority of cases, considerably better protected from the actual physical violence of these same 9 months than the ordinary sailors, factory workers, and rank-and-file Freikorps volunteers whose bodies did the great majority of the period's actual dying. Our symmetry this evening has already named honestly in the specific case of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both killed by soldiers acting with minimal fear of any real accountability, and one that extended just as plainly to the thousands of considerably less famous workers killed in Munich and in the Ruhr, whose own individual names in the great majority of cases appear nowhere in the history books this evening as drawn from, remembered, if at all, only in the collective anonymous casualty totals. Historians have had to reconstruct from incomplete municipal and military records, rather than from any careful contemporary accounting that treated their own individual deaths as worth recording in detail. The specific sound and smell of a country coming apart, in the words of the people who were actually standing in it. Consider for a moment exactly what these 9 months actually felt like at street level, because the diplomatic cables and parliamentary votes this evening has spent so long describing were, for the ordinary Germans living through them, experienced considerably more immediately, as a specific texture of hunger, cold, gunfire and rumour, rather than as any coherent political narrative anyone inside it could have confidently summarised at the time. Diaries and letters preserved from the winter of 1918 and 1919 describe a Berlin in which the ordinary rhythms of daily life, bread queues, streetcar schedules, the opening and closing hours of shops, continued running alongside and sometimes directly through active gun battles a few streets away, residents in some neighbourhoods reporting that they had learned to judge how serious a given day's fighting actually was by the specific calibre and rhythm of the gunfire audible from their own apartment windows. Machine gun fire, meaning a genuine battle somewhere nearby. Isolated rifle shots, meaning, more often than not, only a nervous sentry or a stray round from a demonstration several streets away. Sailors' own letters home from Kiel in the first days of November describe a mixture of genuine exhilaration and genuine disbelief at finding themselves, almost overnight, in command of an entire naval base that had, only days earlier, been governed by an officer corps whose authority had felt, for the whole of their own service, as permanent and as unquestionable as the weather. One sailor's surviving letter to his own family, describing the strange sensation of walking past officers who had shouted at him for minor uniform infractions only a week before, and watching those same officers now avoid his own eye entirely. Notice, honestly too, the specific and considerably less triumphant experience of ordinary German civilians who supported neither the revolution's radical wing nor its moderate one, because a great many middle-class Berliners, shopkeepers, clerks, retired civil servants experienced these same 9 months, chiefly as a prolonged and genuinely frightening collapse of the basic predictability their own lives had always rested on, watching currency and food supplies grow steadily less reliable, watching armed men of increasingly uncertain political allegiance patrol streets that had, for their entire lives, been kept quiet by a police force answerable to an emperor rather than to a committee elected the previous afternoon, and finding, in the specific and often quoted diary entries several such observers left behind, considerably less to celebrate in a revolution that had ended a war they were relieved to see over than genuine and mounting anxiety about what, precisely, was actually replacing the order they had grown up trusting without ever fully examining it. How we actually know all of this, and whose account you should read with a raised eyebrow. Consider briefly exactly where the story this evening has told you actually comes from, because the sources involved carry their own considerable biases, and a story that pretended otherwise would not be dealing with you honestly. Friedrich Ebert himself left behind comparatively little detailed personal testimony about his own private reasoning during these months, a reticence historians have generally attributed to his own lifelong instinct toward caution and toward avoiding public self-justification, which means that a great deal of what we know about his own thinking during the crucial telephone call with Groner comes instead from Groner's own considerably more detailed, and historians reading it since have consistently cautioned, considerably more self-serving post-war testimony. A general eager to present his own bargain with Ebert as a responsible act of statesmanship, rather than as the naked institutional self-preservation a great many later historians have judged it to have actually been. Gustav Noske published his own memoirs in the 1920s, defending at real length his own decision to unleash the Freikorps against the revolutionary left, memoirs that read to modern historians as a document considerably more interested in justifying decisions Noske had already begun to sense history would judge harshly than in offering any genuinely candid reassessment of them. It is worth naming too the specific and genuinely painstaking work later historians undertook to actually establish, decades after the fact, the more reliable details of events that contemporary accounts had left deliberately vague or convenient, particularly the exact circumstances of Liebknecht's and Luxemburg's killings, reconstructed through court records, surviving eyewitness testimony gathered years after the event, and the private correspondence of the soldiers directly involved. A body of research the German historian Klaus Gietinger and others have built into a considerably fuller and considerably more damning account than the military tribunal's own contemporary and conveniently lenient verdict ever provided. Rosa Luxemburg's own extensive prison letters and political writings, preserved and published by sympathetic colleagues in the years after her death, offer, by contrast, an unusually direct and unusually self-aware first-hand record of her own political thinking in these final months, including her own private reservations about the very uprising her death would come to be so closely associated with. A reminder that the individual voices history preserves in greatest detail are rarely evenly distributed across a story's own actual participants, and that a fuller account of any revolution depends on deliberately searching out the considerably more fragmentary traces left behind by the ordinary sailors, workers, and soldiers whose own collective action actually made the whole of it happen in the first place. What became of the men whose decisions this evening are spent so long describing? It is worth closing out the human thread of this particular story by naming, briefly, what actually happened to the men whose choices this evening has walked you through, because their own subsequent lives offer a final, quiet coda to the whole preceding drama. Friedrich Ebert served as President of the German Republic until his own death from a burst appendix in February of 1925, a death historians have often noted was hastened by his own refusal to seek proper medical treatment for his worsening condition, while a libel trial concerning his own conduct during a 1918 wartime strike was still ongoing. A man who spent the last years of his own life defending in courtroom after courtroom a patriotism that a nationalist press never once stopped publicly questioning, despite his own genuine role in holding Germany together through the most dangerous months of its own transition to democracy. Gustav Noske was removed from his own position as defence minister in 1920 in the political aftermath of the Kapp Putsch, having failed, in the eyes of a great many of his own former social democratic colleagues, to adequately prevent an army he had spent 2 years cultivating a close relationship with from very nearly overthrowing the government he served, and spent the whole of the Nazi era living quietly, imprisoned briefly by the Gestapo in the war's final year on suspicion of involvement in the plot against Hitler, despite having had no actual connection to it, and died in 1946 having lived long enough to watch the very republic he had helped both build and, in the judgment of a great many historians since, help institutionally weaken, collapse entirely into precisely the kind of dictatorship he had spent 1919 telling himself the Freikorps existed to prevent. Wilhelm Groener went on to serve in the Republic's final years as both Defence Minister and Interior Minister under Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, and was forced from office in 1932 in a political manoeuvre orchestrated by his own former protégé, General Kurt von Schleicher, a betrayal from within the same military establishment whose own institutional survival Groener had worked so hard to preserve back in 1918, and died in 1939 having lived just long enough to watch the Republic he had helped midwife, and had spent his final years in office trying, with genuine but ultimately unsuccessful effort, to defend against the rising Nazi movement, collapse entirely. Prince Max von Baden, the reluctant final Chancellor of Imperial Germany, retired from public life entirely after 1918 and died in 1929, having spent his own remaining years writing a memoir defending the specific reforms he had pushed through in his own brief and genuinely difficult 6 weeks in office. And it is worth naming plainly one final and rather more ominous thread this evening has not yet drawn all the way out, because a number of the specific Freikorps units that crushed the Spartacists in Berlin and the Bavarian Soviet Republic in Munich, and that later marched on Berlin itself during the Kapp Putsch, brought with them into that same coup attempt a symbol that had, until that point, carried no particular political meaning in German public life at all: the Erhard Naval Brigade, one of the Kapp Putsch's own corps units, marching into Berlin in March of 1920 with swastikas freshly painted on their own helmets, a symbol adopted by a handful of these same nationalist paramilitary veterans years before a failed Austrian painter and fellow war veteran named Adolf Hitler. Then still an obscure figure haunting the same Munich beer halls this evening has already described as fertile ground for exactly this kind of politics in the aftermath of the Bavarian Soviet Republic's own bloody suppression, would go on to make that same symbol the emblem of a movement that would, within 13 years, bring the entire Weimar experiment to its own final, and considerably more catastrophic end. What still stands, in Berlin and in Weimar, of all of this? It is worth remembering briefly, before this evening turns fully toward its own close, what physical and living trace this whole 9-month revolution has actually left behind in the present-day world you will wake back up into tomorrow. Every year, on the closest Sunday to the anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg's and Karl Liebknecht's deaths in the middle of January, tens of thousands of people still gather in Berlin and walk together to the Friedrichsfelde Cemetery, where both are buried, a demonstration that has continued through the Weimar years, through the Nazi dictatorship that suppressed it entirely, through the divided Berlin of the Cold War, and into the reunified German present for more than a century now, making it very likely the single longest continuously observed political commemoration anywhere in modern German history. The stretch of the Landwehr Canal, where Luxemburg's own body was recovered in the spring of 1919, now carries a small memorial plaque along its own bank, a quiet marker easily missed by the joggers and cyclists who pass it on an ordinary Berlin afternoon without any particular awareness of what happened in that same water more than a century ago. The National Theatre in Weimar, where the Constitution's founding assembly actually convened, still stands, rebuilt after later wartime damage, and still hosts to this day a statue of Goethe and Schiller standing together outside its own front steps. The same two poets, whose own reputation for humane cultural refinement Germany's first democratic assembly had hoped, in February of 1919, might somehow prove more durable than the military identity the preceding war had been fought in the name of, a hope history did not, in the end, allow to come fully true. Notice too, honestly, the specific and considerably more sobering way modern Germany's own governing document has been shaped by the direct memory of Article 48's own failure, because the basic law adopted by West Germany in 1949, the constitution still governing a reunified Germany today, was drafted by men who had lived through the Weimar Republic's own final years, and who built into their own new document a deliberately narrower and more carefully checked emergency powers provision, along with an entirely new constitutional court empowered to ban political parties judged to be working to overthrow democracy itself from within, a direct and explicitly acknowledged response to the specific mechanism by which Weimar's own emergency powers clause had eventually been used to help dismantle the very democracy it had been written to protect. A reminder that the revolution and the republic this whole evening has described still shapes, in ways most ordinary Germans encounter only in a school civics lesson, rather than in any daily reminder, the specific legal architecture their own country continues to be governed by today. How much of this was ever actually chosen, and how much simply happened because nobody quite stopped it in time? It is worth pausing in these final quiet minutes on the specific and genuinely uncomfortable question of how much of this whole 9-month sequence was the product of deliberate choice at any single moment, and how much was instead the accumulated result of exhausted, frightened men making the smallest available decision in front of them without ever quite grasping how large its own consequences would eventually grow. Max von Baden's decision to announce Wilhelm's abdication before it had actually happened was, in the narrowest sense, a lie, told under genuine and immediate pressure, with no real alternative available in the moment, and yet it fixed, within hours, an entire nation's understanding of its own emperor's status. Scheidemann's improvised balcony speech was delivered with no text prepared and no authorization from Ebert, a decision made in perhaps 90 seconds by a man reacting to news of Liebknecht's own planned announcement, and yet it settled, in practice if not yet in law, the entire constitutional character of the country that would exist the following morning. And it is worth naming, honestly, that Ebert's own telephone call with Groener, by contrast, was not an accident of the moment at all, but a genuinely deliberate calculation, made with real time to consider its own consequences, And it is precisely this same tangled mixture, split-second improvisation on one side, and careful, consequential deliberation on the other, both feeding into the same 9 months, and both shaping the following 15 years of German history in ways neither the improvisers nor the deliberators could have fully foreseen, that this evening has tried to hold honestly in view, rather than collapse into any simpler story of a single revolution, either wisely planned or recklessly bungled from its very first hour. 6 million men came home in the space of a few weeks, to a country that had nowhere left to actually put them. Consider, before this evening moves any further into the specific political drama unfolding in Berlin's own government offices, on the sheer physical scale of the demobilization Germany was simultaneously attempting to manage across these same months. Because it is easy, focusing on balconies and telephone calls, to lose sight of the considerably more basic logistical catastrophe running underneath the whole of the political one. Germany's army numbered, at the moment the armistice took effect on the 11th of November 1918, something in the range of 6 million men still under arms, spread across the length of the Western Front, occupied Belgium and northern France, and a scattering of eastern territories German forces had occupied earlier in the war, and the armistice terms required the great majority of that same army to withdraw back across the Rhine within a matter of weeks, a movement of men, horses and equipment on a scale that German railway administrators, even working with genuine skill and considerable improvisation, could not actually accomplish without significant chaos, soldiers returning to a home front that had, in the meantime, run out of the specific rail capacity, the housing, and, above nearly everything else, the food actually needed to receive them in anything resembling good order. It is worth remembering, plainly, the specific and rather cruel detail that made this same homecoming considerably harder than it needed to be, because a great many ordinary Germans, both soldiers and civilians, assumed, with real and understandable relief, that the armistice's arrival on the 11th of November would bring an immediate end to the hunger. The wartime blockade this channel's own earlier evening on the Anglo-German rivalry has already described in detail, and instead discovered, within days, that the Allied powers had deliberately chosen to maintain the naval blockade of German ports for months after the fighting itself had actually stopped, a decision made explicitly to preserve leverage over the German government during the peace negotiations still to come, and one that meant a country already exhausted by 4 years of the so-called turnip winter, and its own accumulated malnutrition spent the whole of its own revolutionary winter, the exact same months this evening is spent describing sailors mutinying and councils forming, still substantially cut off from the imported food that might have eased the crisis, a continued hunger that did as much as any single political grievance to keep ordinary Germans in a state of genuine desperation, receptive to whichever political faction, moderate or radical, seemed most likely to actually put bread back on the table soonest. It is hard not to notice how directly this same demobilization crisis fed the specific composition of the Freikorps units this evening, as already described, playing so central a role in crushing the revolutionary left, because the 6 million men pouring back across the Rhine in the winter of 1918 and 1919 arrived in a country with essentially no functioning economy left to absorb them. Factories that had spent 4 years producing shells and uniforms only slowly and unevenly converting back to civilian production, and a great many of these same returning soldiers having spent years developing an entire identity, an entire set of skills, and an entire social world built around military life and military comradeship, found themselves suddenly stripped of rank, of purpose, and very often of any clear civilian prospects at all. A genuinely large population of young, armed, trained, and profoundly disoriented men from whose ranks the Freikorps recruiting officers this evening as already described would go on to draw, with real and troubling ease, tens of thousands of volunteers for whom the promise of continued military structure, continued pay, and a continued enemy to fight, whether Spartacist, Polish or Baltic, offered something considerably more psychologically stable than the demobilised civilian future the rest of the country was attempting, with only partial success to actually build for them. A saddler's apprentice who became the first president of a country that had never elected anybody to anything quite like it before. It is worth turning briefly to the specific man this evening has already placed at the centre of nearly every major decision of these 9 months, because Friedrich Ebert's own path to that same position tells you something genuinely important about the kind of revolution Germany actually had, as opposed to the kind a great many contemporaries, on both the political left and the political right, initially assumed it was having. Ebert was born in 1871, the same year the German Empire itself was founded, the son of a master tailor in the town of Heidelberg, and trained as a young man, not in law or in the military academies that had produced nearly every figure in the imperial government this evening's earlier hours on the Anglo-German rivalry, described building Germany's colonial and naval policy, but as a saddler, a craftsman's trade he practised for several years while travelling, in the manner expected of a young tradesman completing his own apprenticeship, from town to town across Germany, work that exposed him directly and repeatedly to the specific grievances of an industrialising German working class that the empire's own aristocratic political establishment rarely encountered in any first-hand way at all. It is worth naming plainly exactly how Ebert actually rose within the Social Democratic Party across the following 3 decades, because his own particular temperament, cautious, organisationally minded, and instinctively suspicious of grand revolutionary gestures in favour of patient incremental institution building, shaped the entire character of the party he would eventually lead, and in turn, the entire character of the revolution that party would eventually find itself running. Ebert worked his way up through the party's own trade union apparatus and its own local political organising in Bremen, before being elected to the Reichstag in 1912, and was chosen in 1913 as one of the party's 2 co-chairs specifically, because his own considerable organisational skill and his own carefully cultivated reputation for moderation made him acceptable to a party membership that spanned everything from cautious trade unionists to considerably more radical revolutionary theorists, a balancing act Ebert had already spent years perfecting inside his own party's internal politics, well before the November Revolution ever handed him the chancellorship of an entire country to perform the same balancing act on a considerably larger and considerably more dangerous stage. It is hard not to notice, examining Ebert's own private diary entries and correspondence from these same months, exactly how genuinely and how consistently he despised the word revolution itself, a man who, by his own account, had spent his entire adult political life working to build socialism gradually, through elections and through parliamentary reform, and who found himself, in November of 1918, presiding over precisely the kind of sudden, disorderly, extra-legal transformation of government his entire political instinct had spent decades training him to distrust, reportedly remarking to a colleague in the revolution's very first days that he hated revolution like sin itself, a private confession that explains considerably more than any single tactical calculation why Ebert moved so quickly and so consistently across the whole of the following 9 months to convert a genuinely uncontrolled popular uprising into the most orderly, most legally regularised, and most parliamentary outcome he could possibly engineer: a national assembly, a written constitution, a scheduled election, rather than allow the revolution to continue operating through the considerably less predictable mechanism of mass assemblies and workers' councils. A man of his own, careful incremental temperament had never felt even remotely comfortable trusting. A newspaper smuggled out of prison under the name of a slave who once led a rebellion against Rome. It is worth turning now to the specific radical current Ebert's own careful moderation was reacting against for the whole of these same 9 months, because Karl Liebknecht's own political journey and the movement he helped build had roots considerably older than the November Revolution itself, reaching back to the very earliest and most dangerous days of German opposition to the war. Liebknecht, the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the actual founders of the Social Democratic Party back in the 19th century, was already, by his own family inheritance, about as close to socialist royalty as German politics produced, and distinguished himself in December of 1914 as the single, lone member of the entire Reichstag willing to vote against the war credits, funding Germany's own participation in the war, a vote of open public defiance that made him, almost overnight, a target of considerable official hostility and a hero to the small, increasingly isolated minority of German socialists who had never accepted their own party's wartime decision to support the government it had spent decades otherwise opposing. Notice plainly the specific underground organisation Liebknecht helped build out of that same isolated opposition, because its own chosen name would go on to define an entire political movement and, eventually, an entire and consequential moment of German history this evening has already described in detail. Liebknecht, together with Rosa Luxemburg and a small circle of like-minded anti-war socialists, founded in 1916 an illegal underground group that published a clandestine newspaper called the Spartacist Letters, smuggled between cities and printed at considerable personal risk to everyone involved, named deliberately after Spartacus, the enslaved gladiator who had led a major rebellion against the Roman Republic nearly 2,000 years earlier, a name chosen specifically to evoke a rebellion of the oppressed against an empire that considered itself invincible, and one that gave the movement, and eventually the uprising this evening has already described, being crushed in January of 1919. The name history would remember it by the Spartacist uprising, even though, as this evening has already made a point of naming honestly, the actual January fighting was considerably less centrally planned by the Spartacist leadership than that same evocative name has often led people to assume. It is hard not to notice how directly Liebknecht's own wartime imprisonment shaped the specific radicalism he brought back to Berlin streets in November of 1918, because Liebknecht was arrested in May of 1916 for organising an anti-war demonstration in Berlin's own Potsdamer Platz, tried by a military court, and sentenced to more than 4 years of hard labour, a sentence he was still serving, in conditions his own surviving letters describe as genuinely brutal, when a general amnesty issued in October of 1918, as part of Max von Baden's own broader package of reforms this evening has already described, released him back into a Berlin already, within days, on the very edge of revolution, meaning Liebknecht arrived back among the crowds that would go on to hear his own balcony proclamation, only weeks after walking out of a prison cell, a compressed and genuinely disorienting transition from convicted enemy of the state to, for one brief afternoon, the man declaring a new socialist republic from the balcony of the very palace. The emperor he had spent years imprisoned for opposing had so recently fled. A doctor of economics from Russian Poland who spent the war's worst years writing from inside a prison cell. It is worth turning to Rosa Luxemburg's own considerably different path into the same movement, because her own biography adds a dimension to this whole story that a purely German account of the revolution would leave out entirely. Luxemburg was born in 1871 in Russian-controlled Poland, into a Jewish family in the city of Zamość, and left the Russian Empire as a young woman specifically to escape the political persecution her own early socialist activism had already attracted, earning a doctorate in economics from the University of Zurich, one of the very few European universities of the period willing to grant a woman, and specifically a Polish Jewish woman, that same credential, before settling in Germany and becoming, over the following 2 decades, one of the most intellectually formidable theorists in the entire European socialist movement, a woman whose own published critiques of capitalism's tendency toward imperial expansion, and whose own equally sharp critiques of the more rigid centralised currents within her own socialist movement, earned her real respect and in roughly equal measure, real hostility from colleagues on nearly every side of her own party's internal disputes. Consider honestly exactly what Luxemburg did with her own time during the more than 3 years she spent across the course of the war, imprisoned for her own anti-war organising, because it reveals a mind considerably more independent and considerably less doctrinaire than either her later communist admirers or her later anti-communist critics have often found convenient to remember. Luxemburg wrote from inside her own prison cell in 1915 an extended pamphlet, published clandestinely under the pen name Junius, that argued with real and prescient force that the war then consuming Europe represented not a defensible national struggle for either side, but a catastrophic act of imperial self-destruction, that the whole of European socialism had failed, through its own wartime capitulation to nationalist sentiment, to prevent a text that circulated at real risk to everyone caught distributing it, among the small underground network that would go on to become the Spartacist movement, and that stands, read now, as one of the more genuinely clear-eyed pieces of political writing produced by anyone on any side of the war, while the fighting itself was still underway. It is worth naming too, honestly, the specific personal and political toll her own final months exacted, because Luxemburg's own considerable private courage in the face of what she plainly recognised in her own surviving correspondence from December of 1918 and January of 1919 as a genuinely dangerous and poorly prepared confrontation, deserves to be remembered alongside her own considerable political foresight rather than eclipsed by it. Luxemburg wrote, in one of her own final published articles, only days before her own death, an essay that both defended the revolutionary uprising then underway in Berlin's streets as a genuine expression of working-class aspiration, and, in the very same piece, offered a startlingly honest critique of the specific tactical mistakes her own younger comrades had just made, a document that closes with a line historians have quoted ever since, expressing her own settled conviction that the revolutionary movement, whatever setbacks it suffered in any single week, would rise again, a prediction that Luxemburg herself would not live to see tested, murdered within days of writing it, but one that nonetheless captures, better than almost anything else this evening has quoted, the specific combination of clear-eyed realism and unbroken conviction that made her, in the judgment of a great many historians writing in the century since, one of the genuinely serious political minds Germany's revolution produced, and then, through its own worst impulses, destroyed. A fever nobody in Berlin had time to properly notice, arriving in the same weeks as the mutiny itself. It is worth remembering briefly one further and genuinely underappreciated layer of suffering running underneath the whole of this revolutionary autumn, because the same weeks in which sailors mutinied at Kiel and councils spread across Germany's cities also happened to fall within the second and considerably more lethal wave of the global influenza pandemic, already sweeping across a war-exhausted Europe, a disease German records of the period call, as records nearly everywhere else in the world did that same season, the Spanish influenza, though its own actual origins remain to this day a subject of continued historical debate, rather than any settled certainty. German cities already straining under malnutrition, overcrowded troop trains, and a public health system stretched thin by 4 years of wartime demand found themselves, across October and November of 1918, absorbing a further wave of death that historians estimate killed several 100,000 Germans in these same months alone, deaths that arrived in hospitals and tenement apartments already crowded with returning soldiers, and that a great many contemporary diarists, understandably preoccupied with the political drama unfolding in the streets outside their own windows, mentioned only in passing, if at all. A reminder that the revolution this evening has spent so long describing in terms of proclamations and councils was experienced by a great many ordinary Germans that same autumn, chiefly as one further source of exhausted, grieving background noise in a year that had already delivered considerably more grief than any single family could reasonably be expected to absorb. What Paris and London and Washington actually watched and genuinely feared, while Berlin's own revolution unfolded. It is worth turning now, briefly, to the view from outside Germany, because the Allied governments negotiating an armistice and, within months, an entire peace settlement, were watching the revolution this evening as described unfold with an attention considerably more anxious than a simple accounting of defeated enemy affairs might suggest. The Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia the previous year, and the subsequent and by late 1918 still very much unresolved Russian Civil War, had left Allied leaders in Paris, London and Washington genuinely and openly worried that a defeated, hungry and politically volatile Germany might follow precisely the same revolutionary path, a fear that shaped Allied policy in several concrete ways, contributing directly to the decision this evening has already described to maintain the naval blockade of German ports well after the armistice, on the specific theory that a Germany kept hungry enough to remain politically unstable was, paradoxically, less dangerous to negotiate with than a fully fed one might have been, since instability of exactly this kind kept Berlin's negotiators desperate for a swift settlement on whatever terms the Allies were prepared to offer. Notice, honestly too, exactly how directly this same Allied anxiety about a potential German Bolshevik revolution shaped the private calculations Ebert and his own moderate colleagues were making on the opposite side of the same equation, because Ebert's own government understood, with real clarity, that a Germany visibly sliding toward a Soviet-style revolution risked not merely internal chaos, but a considerably harsher peace settlement from Allied powers who might otherwise decide that a genuinely Bolshevik Germany deserved to be treated as an active and dangerous threat rather than merely as a defeated one. A calculation that fed directly into Ebert's own urgent private determination, expressed repeatedly in his own surviving correspondence from these months, to demonstrate to the watching Allied governments that Germany's own revolution, whatever its own genuinely radical early moments in places like Kiel and Munich, was going to resolve itself into a stable, moderate parliamentary outcome rather than into a second front of the same revolutionary contagion already consuming Russia, a foreign policy consideration layered directly on top of Ebert's own already deeply felt domestic instinct against anything resembling a genuinely uncontrolled revolution. Both hands held open at once on the men who actually pulled the triggers in January and in Munich. It is worth pausing, honestly, on the Freikorps volunteers themselves, rather than only on the government officials who deployed them, because a story that treated these same men purely as interchangeable instruments of violence would be leaving out a genuinely important and genuinely uncomfortable part of how ordinary Germans actually experienced their own country's defeat. A great many Freikorps volunteers were young men who had spent the entirety of their own adult lives, from their late teenage years onward, at war, who had watched friends and in a great many cases brothers die in a conflict they had been raised from childhood to believe was being fought in defence of a civilization worth dying for, and who returned home, as this evening has already described, to a country that seemed, almost overnight, to have declared that entire sacrifice not merely lost, but actively shameful. Their own emperor gone, their own officers stripped of the deference these same young men had spent years being taught to regard as the natural order of things, and a new government led by exactly the Socialist Party, whose own wartime opposition to continued military funding, a great many of these same veterans had spent years at the front regarding as a betrayal of everything they were risking their lives for. And yet it is worth naming, plainly and without softening, exactly where that same genuinely understandable disorientation curdled into something considerably less defensible, because a great many Freikorps units, as this evening has already described in the specific and well-documented case of Rosa Luxemburg's and Karl Liebknecht's own killings, went well beyond any reasonable exercise of force needed to restore civic order, executing captured or surrendering combatants, in a great many cases summarily and without any pretense of legal process, killing unarmed civilians mistaken, often carelessly, for combatants, and bringing to Munich in particular a level of ideological hatred, explicitly anti-Semitic in a great many surviving accounts, a great many of the Bavarian Soviet Republic's own leading figures having been, like Luxemburg herself, Jewish, that went considerably beyond any ordinary counter-revolutionary military discipline, and that presaged with a clarity historians have found genuinely chilling. In retrospect, the considerably larger and considerably more organised violence the very same political current would go on to help unleash across the whole of Europe within little more than a decade, where East Germany built statues and West Germany argued about which parts of the story to actually teach. Consider, too, honestly, The specific and genuinely divided afterlife Rosa Luxemburg's and Karl Liebknecht's own memory went on to have across the following 7 decades of German history, because the two halves of a Germany later divided by the Cold War told, for the whole of that division, 2 almost entirely different stories about what these same 2 figures actually represented. The communist government of East Germany, established after the Second World War, adopted Luxemburg and Liebknecht as foundational martyrs of German communism, naming streets, schools and public squares after both figures, staging elaborate annual state commemorations at their own graveside, and presenting their own murder by Freikorps units under a social democratic government as the opening chapter of a much longer story of working-class betrayal by moderate socialism, a version of events that conveniently allowed East Germany's own ruling party to claim direct ideological dissent from the Spartacist movement, while glossing over, with considerable political convenience, Luxemburg's own well-documented and often sharply critical writings about exactly the kind of centralised, undemocratic party rule East Germany's own government would go on to practice. West Germany, by contrast, spent considerably longer working out how to publicly commemorate 2 figures whose own political tradition sat uneasily alongside a post-war West German state built explicitly around anti-communism. The annual Luxemburg-Liebknecht commemoration march this evening has already described continuing, across these same Cold War decades, chiefly as an event organised by West Germany's own political left, and viewed with real suspicion by a great many mainstream West German institutions, a division in memory that only began to properly resolve itself after German reunification in 1990, when historians on both sides of the former divide gained fuller access to archival material long restricted or politically managed on either side, and were finally able to construct the considerably more nuanced account, drawing on Luxemburg's own private reservations about the January uprising, and on the genuinely documented brutality of her own killers that this evening has tried to present to you tonight. The first woman ever to speak from the podium of a German national parliament. It is worth remembering plainly one further and genuinely significant figure this evening has not yet properly introduced, because the same National Assembly election that brought German women to the polls for the first time also sent a considerable number of women directly into the new Assembly's own chamber, and one of them delivered a speech worth remembering in its own right. Marie Juchacz, a Social Democratic delegate elected to the National Assembly convened at Weimar, rose to address the assembled delegates on the 19th of February 1919, becoming the very first woman in German history to speak from the podium of any German national parliament, and opened her own remarks not with any grand rhetorical flourish, but with a single, plainly stated observation that a great many of her own male colleagues found genuinely startling in its own directness, remarking that what had, until only weeks earlier, been described in official German usage as women's suffrage was, properly understood, not a gift bestowed on women by a benevolent state at all, but simply and belatedly the recognition of a right women had always possessed as full citizens, a distinction Juchacz insisted on making plainly, in front of an assembly still overwhelmingly composed of men who had spent their entire prior careers governing a country in which women's political voice had counted for nothing at all. It is worth naming too, alongside Juchacz, the considerably more radical Clara Zetkin, a longtime friend and political ally of Rosa Luxemburg who had spent decades before the war organising specifically among German working women, and who went on, after the January fighting had cost the movement Luxemburg's own leadership, to become one of the Communist Party's own most prominent voices for the remainder of the Weimar years. A reminder that the specific question of what genuine political equality for German women ought to actually mean was itself contested across this same revolutionary period, between the same moderate and radical currents contesting nearly everything else this evening has described, Juchacz building her own version of women's emancipation through parliamentary reform and expanded social welfare provision. Zetkin insisting that no genuine liberation for working women could arrive through parliamentary means alone. An artist who had already lost her own son to the war years before she ever picked up a pencil to mourn a revolution. Notice briefly one further and genuinely moving thread of cultural memory this evening has not yet had occasion to draw out, because the revolution's own human cost found its way into German art almost as quickly as it found its way into the newspapers reporting on it. Käthe Kollwitz, a Berlin artist whose own younger son Peter had been killed on the Western Front in the war's opening months, spent the years immediately following the armistice producing a body of prints and drawings, mourning both her own personal loss and the wider human cost of a war and a revolution. She had watched consume an entire generation of young German men, work that included a memorial woodcut honouring Karl Liebknecht, created at the direct request of Liebknecht's own grieving family after his own murder, an image of mourning workers gathered around a fallen figure that has gone on to become one of the single most reproduced pieces of German graphic art from the entire revolutionary period. A quiet, grief-stricken counterpoint, worth sitting with for a moment, to the considerably louder and considerably more triumphalist official commemorations either side of this same story's political divide would go on to prefer. A railway carriage in a French forest, and the specific German civilian handed the job no general wanted. It is worth turning back briefly to the actual signing of the armistice itself, because this evening has so far mentioned it chiefly in passing, and the specific circumstances of its signing matter enormously to understanding the resentment that would go on to follow the men who actually put their names to it. The German delegation sent to negotiate the armistice terms with the Allied Supreme Commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, in a railway carriage parked in the forest of Compiègne north of Paris, was led not by any general, since Hindenburg and Ludendorff had both made abundantly clear their own unwillingness to be personally associated with the humiliation of requesting terms, but by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician from the Catholic Centre Party, who had spent much of the war as one of the Reichstag's more consistent voices for a negotiated peace, and who arrived at Compiègne on the 8th of November 1918, the day before Scheidemann's own balcony proclamation in Berlin, to find Foch presenting armistice terms considerably harsher than the German delegation had been led to expect. Immediate German withdrawal from all occupied territory and from Alsace-Lorraine, the surrender of a large portion of Germany's own remaining artillery, aircraft and naval vessels, and continued Allied occupation of German territory west of the Rhine. It is hard not to notice the specific and genuinely telling detail of exactly who was and was not willing to attach their own name to that same document, because Erzberger, given barely 72 hours by his own government to accept terms he had no real power to negotiate down in any meaningful way, and facing an army whose own senior command had already privately conceded the war lost weeks earlier, while carefully ensuring none of that same admission would be traceable to their own signatures, signed the armistice in the early hours of the 11th of November 1918, becoming, for the whole of the following 3 years of his own life, the specific civilian face German nationalist opinion would attach to the whole of the war's ending, a resentment considerably more personal and considerably more dangerous than the abstract stab-in-the-back mythology this evening has already described, since it fixed onto one identifiable man the blame an entire military establishment had worked, with real and calculated care to avoid ever being fixed onto itself. What became of Erzberger deserves telling here rather than left for later, because it is one of the more direct and most brutal illustrations of exactly how far the political violence that began with the Freikorps this evening, as already described, would go on to travel beyond the specific revolutionary months this story has centred itself on. Erzberger went on, after signing the armistice, to serve as German finance minister in the early Weimar government, a position from which he pursued a programme of tax reform that made him, on top of the armistice signature nationalist opinion already despised him for, a target of considerable hostility from Germany's wealthier classes as well, and was shot twice and killed on the 26th of August 1921 while out walking in the Black Forest by two former Freikorps members belonging to a secret right-wing terrorist organisation calling itself Organisation Consul, a group that drew, in considerable part, on precisely the same demobilised, radicalised paramilitary veterans this evening, as already described flowing out of the crushed Ruhr uprising and the failed Kapp Putsch, and into an underground campaign of political assassination that would go on within the following year to also claim the life of Germany's own foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, a direct and considerably darker continuation of the same violent current this whole evening has spent so long tracing back to its own revolutionary origins, coffeehouse poets running a government and the considerably harder men who replaced them within a fortnight. It is worth returning, with somewhat more care than this evening has offered so far, to the specific and genuinely strange character of the Bavarian Soviet Republic's own earliest phase, because its own brief existence deserves to be remembered as something considerably stranger and, in its own way, considerably more poignant than a simple prelude to the violence that ended it. The government that declared the Bavarian Soviet Republic on the 7th of April 1919, in the days immediately following Kurt Eisner's own assassination, was led initially by a small circle of writers and intellectuals, the anarchist playwright and translator Gustav Landauer, the expressionist poet and dramatist Ernst Toller, and the satirist and bohemian activist Erich Mühsam among them, men whose own genuine commitment to an idealistic, culturally minded vision of revolutionary transformation, abolishing money, they briefly proposed, and replacing conventional currency with a system based on labour time, expanding free university education, and establishing what Landauer himself called a genuine community of the spirit, ran considerably ahead of any practical capacity to actually govern a modern industrial state in the middle of a food and fuel crisis, a government that one of its own participants later admitted, with a certain rueful honesty, had spent rather more of its brief existence drafting proclamations about universal brotherhood than actually ensuring Munich's bakeries had flour. It is hard not to notice how quickly that same idealistic and largely undefended first government gave way, within barely a week, to a considerably harder-edged second phase led by the Communist Party organiser Eugène Leviné, a disciplined Bolshevik-aligned revolutionary who took over leadership of the Bavarian Soviet Republic in the last week of April 1919, and who moved immediately to organise an actual defensive militia, the Red Army of Bavaria, nationalise a number of Munich's banks and industries, and prepare with real seriousness for the armed confrontation Leviné correctly anticipated was coming from Berlin, a preparation that nonetheless proved entirely inadequate against the combined regular army and Freikorps force of some 30,000 men that Ebert's national government dispatched to retake the city at the very end of April and the first days of May. Consider, plainly, exactly what happened to the men who had led both phases of that same brief government, because their own individual fates capture something genuinely important about how thoroughly this suppression blurred any distinction between armed combatants and unarmed idealists. Gustav Landauer, taken prisoner by Freikorps soldiers after the city's fall, despite having already resigned from the government days before Leviné's own harder faction took over, was beaten to death by his own captors on the 2nd of May 1919, in a killing so brutal that even some of the Freikorps' own officers present expressed private discomfort at it afterward, while Eugène Leviné, captured shortly after, was tried by a military court and executed by firing squad on the 5th of June 1919, going to his own death, by the account of witnesses present, with the calm and considered dignity of a man who had known from the very moment he accepted leadership of a hopeless defence that this same outcome was the likeliest one waiting for him. Ernst Toller, captured and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment rather than execution, used his own considerable time in a Bavarian fortress prison to write a body of plays that would go on to make him one of the most performed German dramatists of the entire 1920s, a rare case, among this evening's long roll call of the revolution's dead and imprisoned, of a man who survived his own captivity to build a genuinely significant second career, before eventually fleeing Germany after the Nazi seizure of power and taking his own life in New York in 1939. Unable, by his own account, to bear watching a second and even larger catastrophe consume the country he had once tried, in his own idealistic and badly overmatched way, to remake. A sword handed to a Dutch customs officer at a border crossing nobody had bothered to properly guard. It is worth returning briefly to Wilhelm himself at the specific and rather anticlimactic moment his own exile actually began, because the scene deserves a somewhat closer look than this evening's earlier account of his abdication offered. Wilhelm crossed the Dutch border at the small village of Aisden in the early hours of the 10th of November 1918, travelling by imperial train with a modest personal entourage and a considerable quantity of luggage that included, by the accounts of Dutch officials present that morning, dozens of trunks, several of his own favourite dogs, and, in a detail several contemporary observers found genuinely difficult to reconcile with the scale of the catastrophe he was fleeing, his own collection of ceremonial hunting equipment, and was received not by any formal state welcome, since the Dutch government had received no advance diplomatic notice of his own arrival at all, but by a local Dutch customs official who, following ordinary and entirely unremarkable border procedure, asked the recently deposed German emperor to formally surrender his own ceremonial sword before being permitted to continue into Dutch territory. A small bureaucratic formality that Wilhelm, by every account of those present, submitted to without complaint, a strange and genuinely deflating final image of imperial authority, an emperor who had spent 30 years personally obsessing, as this evening's earlier account of the Anglo-German naval rivalry has already described in detail, over the precise calibre of his own battleship guns, handing his own sword across a village customs table, to a minor Dutch civil servant simply doing his own ordinary Sunday morning job. An election fought in Britain that same December under the slogan of hanging the man who had just crossed that same border. It is worth naming briefly how differently the news of Wilhelm's own abdication and exile was actually received on the opposite side of the North Sea, because the contrast illuminates something genuinely important about how completely the war had reshaped ordinary popular sentiment in Britain by the time it actually ended. The British general election held in December of 1918, called by Prime Minister David Lloyd George within weeks of the armistice specifically to capitalise on his own government's wartime popularity, was fought, in considerable part, on a wave of public anger toward Germany generally and toward Wilhelm personally, a mood several of Lloyd George's own campaign supporters captured in the considerably blunter, popular slogan calling for the deposed emperor to be hanged, a sentiment formal enough that the eventual Treaty of Versailles would include, as this channel's own earlier evening on the Anglo-German rivalry has already described, an explicit provision calling for Wilhelm's own extradition and trial, a demand the Dutch government, despite considerable and sustained Allied diplomatic pressure across the following years, simply declined to honour, granting Wilhelm the quiet, permanent asylum at Huisdawn that same earlier evening has already described him living out for the following 22 years. Two men in Moscow, watching Berlin's own revolution with considerably more hope than Berlin's own revolutionaries ever quite managed to justify. Consider, for a moment, how this whole 9-month upheaval looked from the outside, specifically from the vantage point of the Bolshevik government in Moscow, because Vladimir Lenin and his own closest colleagues followed events in Germany across these same months with an attention that reveals just how much the survival of their own revolution in Russia was believed, at the time, to depend on socialist revolutions spreading successfully into the considerably richer and considerably more industrially developed Germany next door. Lenin's own Marxist theory had always held that a socialist revolution succeeding first in a comparatively backward, agrarian country like Russia could only really endure if it was followed, reasonably quickly, by a similar revolution in one of Europe's genuinely advanced industrial economies, Germany above all, a belief that made the news reaching Moscow of a Kiel mutiny and spreading workers' councils in the first days of November 1918 a source of real and openly expressed celebration inside the Bolshevik leadership, and that made the news reaching Moscow only weeks later of the Council's Congress voting to hand power to a parliamentary National Assembly instead, a source of equally real and considerably more bitter disappointment. The Communist International, founded in Moscow in March of 1919, only weeks after the Spartacist uprising this evening has already described being crushed in Berlin, was built, in no small part, on the explicit hope that Germany's own defeat in the January fighting represented only a temporary setback rather than a final verdict. its own founding documents naming the German working class specifically as the force expected to carry the revolution that had begun in Russia into the heart of industrial Europe, a hope that would go on across the following years to prove considerably harder to realise than its own founders in Moscow had imagined in the spring of 1919. Germany's own considerably more moderate, considerably more parliamentary revolutionary settlement holding in the event for the better part of the following decade and a half, however imperfectly, against every subsequent attempt from either the political left or eventually the political right to overturn it by force. A flag fought over almost as bitterly as the Constitution flying beneath it. There is a specific and genuinely telling argument that consumed a considerable amount of the National Assembly's own floor time at Weimar, worth pausing on briefly, because it shows how deeply even the most basic symbols of the new state remained contested among delegates, who agreed, in the main, on remarkably little else. The old imperial flag, black, white and red, had flown over Germany since unification in 1871, and a great many of the more conservative and nationalist delegates at Weimar argued strenuously for its continued use, viewing any change as a further and unnecessary insult to a defeated nation, already being asked to accept enough humiliation from the peace conference then underway in Paris, while the Assembly's own social democratic and liberal majority insisted on adopting black, red and gold instead. Colours drawn deliberately from the flag flown by the liberal and nationalist revolutionaries of 1848, the last previous occasion on which German democrats had attempted, and ultimately failed, to build a unified constitutional German state, a choice meant to signal continuity with that earlier, considerably more hopeful democratic tradition, rather than with the militarised empire the new republic had just replaced. The compromise the Assembly eventually settled on, black, red and gold, as the republic's own official national flag, with a specific and separate provision preserving the old black, white and red imperial colours for use in a small corner of the merchant naval ensign, satisfied almost nobody completely and would go on, across the following decade, to become a genuine flashpoint of ordinary political identity. Germans who supported the Republic flying the new black-red-gold banner from their own homes and storefronts. Germans who did not, a considerably larger number than the Republic's own founders would have liked, continuing to display the old imperial colours as a quiet and unmistakable statement of where their own loyalties still actually lay. A small piece of cloth carrying for the whole of the Republic's 14 years a symbolic weight considerably heavier than its own modest size would suggest. The men who told the whole world the army had never really lost, doing so from considerably safer distances than the sailors they blamed for losing it. It is time, finally, to return to Hindenburg and Ludendorff themselves, the two men whose own private September admission that the war was lost open this whole evening's story, because their own subsequent careers trace, with an almost too neat symmetry, the entire arc from the revolution this evening has described to the catastrophe that would eventually follow it. Ludendorff fled to Sweden within weeks of the armistice, travelling under a false identity and a pair of blue-tinted spectacles meant to disguise a face that had, until only recently, appeared on the front page of nearly every German newspaper, and spent his own years in exile there writing the first drafts of the very stab-in-the-back narrative this evening has already described, before returning to Germany and involving himself in 1923 in an attempted coup led by an obscure Bavarian nationalist agitator named Adolf Hitler, marching alongside Hitler through the streets of Munich in the failed beer hall putsch, and standing trial for it afterward, a trial from which Ludendorff, unlike Hitler, emerged fully acquitted. A war hero's reputation still commanding enough residual public deference that a Bavarian court proved unwilling to convict him of treason, even for an offence he had quite openly and publicly committed. Hindenburg's own path ran, if anything, to a considerably more consequential destination. Elected president of the very Weimar Republic, he had done so much to help discredit in 1925, following Ebert's own death, and re-elected in 1932 at the age of 84 specifically as the candidate moderate and conservative, Germans hoped could hold back the growing electoral strength of Hitler's own National Socialist Party, Hindenburg spent his own final years in office presiding over precisely the kind of governing by emergency decree this evening has already described Article 48 making possible, a provision Hugo Preuss had written in good faith to help a fragile young democracy defend itself, and that Hindenburg's own chancellors, across the early 1930s, used instead to bypass an increasingly paralysed and fragmented Reichstag entirely, before Hindenburg himself on the 30th of January 1933, in what would prove to be very nearly the final significant act of his own long life, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany, a decision made by every serious historical account since, out of a calculation that Hitler could be safely contained and managed within a conventional coalition cabinet, a calculation that ranks, considered honestly alongside everything else this long evening has described, among the single most catastrophic misjudgments made by any of the men. This whole story has asked you to hold in mind an old field marshal who had spent 1918 privately conceding a war was lost while publicly blaming its loss on others, closing his own career 15 years later by handing the keys of the very republic that revolution had produced to the one movement that would go on to make his own earlier catastrophe look, in the fullness of time, almost survivable by comparison. A chancellor who survived being poisoned only to watch, from exile, everything he had proclaimed from that Reichstag window come apart. It is worth returning briefly to Philipp Scheidemann himself, the man whose own improvised balcony speech proclaimed the Republic this whole evening as described being built and eventually lost, because his own subsequent life offers a considerably more personal illustration of exactly how dangerous German public life became for the Republic's own founding figures across the following decade. Scheidemann served briefly as the Weimar Republic's first Prime Minister in 1919 before resigning in protest over the Treaty of Versailles' own harsh terms, a treaty he refused to have his own name attached to signing, and survived in June of 1922 a serious assassination attempt by right-wing extremists who sprayed prussic acid into his own face while he was out walking, an attack Scheidemann survived only because his own attackers used a diluted and ultimately non-lethal concentration of the poison, one further data point, worth sitting with alongside Erzberger's own murder that same period, in the mounting toll of political violence directed specifically at the moderate socialist founders of a republic an increasingly radicalised nationalist right had never accepted as legitimate. Scheidemann fled Germany entirely after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, spending his own final years in exile in Denmark and then the United States, and died in 1939, watching from abroad in his own final months precisely the war his own generation had already fought and lost, once beginning to gather itself for a second and even more catastrophic round. Success or failure, depending entirely on which particular year you happen to be asking the question from. It is worth sitting, honestly, in these later hours of tonight's long story, with the genuinely difficult question of whether this whole 9-month revolution should actually be remembered as a success or as a failure, because serious historians have argued both positions with real conviction, and the honest answer depends considerably on which specific measuring stick and which specific year you choose to apply it from. Judged against the goal Ebert himself set out to achieve, an orderly, legally regularised transition from autocratic empire to functioning parliamentary democracy, accomplished without descending into the kind of prolonged civil war then consuming Russia, the revolution succeeded, and succeeded, this evening will say plainly, rather more completely than a great many contemporary observers in November of 1918 actually expected it to. Judged against the goal Liebknecht and Luxemburg's own considerably more radical wing had hoped for, a genuine and lasting transformation of German economic and social structure built on the direct ongoing authority of workers' councils rather than merely on a change of political personnel at the top, the revolution failed almost completely. Its own most committed proponents killed or marginalised within its first 10 weeks. And judged against the considerably longer arc of German history, the arc that runs from Weimar's own founding constitution through Hindenburg's own fateful appointment of Hitler in 1933, The revolution's own success in avoiding one kind of catastrophe in 1918 and 1919 did remarkably little. In the end, to prevent an even larger catastrophe from arriving barely 14 years later. A sobering final complication this evening has no interest in smoothing over for the sake of a tidier ending. Crowds gathering under the Brandenburg Gate before anybody had actually decided what they were celebrating. Picture, for a moment, the specific physical texture of Berlin on the morning of the 9th of November 1918, because the printed record of speeches and telephone calls this evening has relied on so heavily can make that same morning sound considerably more orderly, in retrospect, than it actually felt to the people standing inside it. Columns of workers, many still wearing their own factory overalls, streamed out of Berlin's industrial districts toward the government quarter along Wilhelmstrasse from the early morning hours onward, joined along the way by soldiers who had abandoned their own barracks entirely, red flags and red armbands appearing by mid-morning on men who, only days before, had worn nothing more provocative than the standard grey of the Imperial Army, the crowd swelling by early afternoon to a size several contemporary accounts describe as larger than anything Berlin had witnessed even in the war's own opening weeks of patriotic enthusiasm back in 1914, moving not toward any single planned rallying point, but simply toward wherever word of the latest development, an abdication rumour, a chancellery resignation, a balcony speech about to begin, happened to be spreading fastest at that particular hour. Notice too the specific and rather ordinary confusion running underneath all that same crowd energy, because a great many of the people filling Berlin streets that day had, by their own later accounts, remarkably little clear sense of exactly what political outcome they were actually demonstrating for, wanting, in the plainest and most immediate terms available to them, simply an end to a war that had killed or maimed a member of nearly every family in the city and enough food to actually get their own households through the coming winter, aims considerably less ideologically precise than either Ebert's careful parliamentary vision or Liebknecht's Soviet Republic, and it is this same enormous, only loosely organised mass of exhausted, hungry, grieving Berliners, considerably more than any single revolutionary committee's own careful planning, that actually supplied the raw physical force behind everything this evening has described happening in the capital that day. A reminder that revolutions, whatever shape their own eventual histories settle into, tend to begin as considerably blunter and considerably more elemental expressions of exhaustion than the tidy ideological labels later applied to them ever quite capture. Saxony, Braunschweig and Württemberg, each finding its own slightly different way to the same basic outcome. It is worth widening the frame briefly beyond Berlin, Kiel and Munich. The three cities this evening has spent the greatest share of its own attention on, because the revolution's actual geography ran considerably wider than even those three cities suggest. Nearly every one of Germany's constituent kingdoms and grand duchies experiencing its own local version of the same basic sequence across that same first week of November. In Saxony, workers' and soldiers' councils seized control of Leipzig and Dresden within days of the Kiel Mutiny, the Saxon king abdicating quietly and without any of the violence that would later mark Bavaria's own considerably more turbulent path. While in the Duchy of Braunschweig, a council led by the radical socialist August Mergis declared a socialist republic on the same day Eisner declared his own in Munich, going on to hold power, in a detail few outside the region remember today, longer than almost any other genuinely radical council government established anywhere in Germany that same November. Württemberg's own king abdicated on the 9th of November, with a notably resigned and almost weary formal statement, releasing his own officials and subjects from their oath of loyalty, a phrase echoed, with only minor variation, by monarch after German monarch across that same single week, each of Germany's roughly 20 remaining princely rulers stepping down inside barely 72 hours of one another, in a cascade of abdications that left, by the middle of November 1918, not one single hereditary monarchy anywhere left standing across the whole of a country that had, only a decade earlier, been governed by more reigning kings, grand dukes and princes than any other nation in Europe. A currency that had already begun quietly losing its own value, while everyone's attention was fixed on balconies and constitutions. It is worth remembering briefly one further thread of consequence running underneath the whole of this revolutionary period, because the financial arrangements Germany's imperial government had made to pay for the war it had just lost would go on to shape the young republic's own economic life considerably more than any single political settlement this evening has described. Unlike Britain and France, which had funded a considerable share of their own wartime spending through direct taxation, Imperial Germany had financed the great majority of the war through borrowing, issuing war bonds to its own citizens on the confident public assumption that a victorious Germany would eventually repay that same debt out of reparations extracted from its defeated enemies, an assumption the war's actual outcome inverted entirely, leaving the new republic instead responsible for its own enormous accumulated war debt, and, on top of it, the reparations payments the Treaty of Versailles imposed, a financial burden that the German government, across the very same months this evening, has spent describing councils and constitutions, had already begun addressing by printing additional currency, a quiet and, at the time, comparatively modest expedient that had already, by the time the constitution was signed at Weimar in August of 1919, begun eroding the mark's own value in ways that would go on, within only another 4 years, to produce the catastrophic hyperinflation that swallowed the life savings of a great many of the same ordinary Germans this evening has described marching through Berlin's streets in November of 1918, a slower burning fire, worth naming honestly alongside the more dramatic one this evening has already spent so long describing, running quietly beneath the whole of the young republic's own finances from very nearly its first day in existence. An army that marched home through its own cheering hometowns in perfect order, and handed its enemies the single most useful piece of evidence for the myth that would follow. There is a specific and genuinely important irony worth sitting with regarding the German army's own physical return from the front, because the very discipline and good order in which the great bulk of that same army actually withdrew back across the Rhine in the weeks immediately following the armistice would go on to be used almost immediately as supposed proof of exactly the opposite conclusion the retreat's own orderliness should have suggested. German units marched back into their own home garrison towns across late November and December of 1918 in formal columns, with bands playing and regimental flags still flying, greeted in many towns by crowds that turned out specifically to welcome home soldiers who did not, on the whole, look or move like the beaten remnant of a defeated army, an appearance of continued discipline that Hindenburg and Ludendorff and the whole of the emerging nationalist right would go on to seize upon as visible confirmation that the army itself had never actually been defeated in the field at all, conveniently leaving out the considerably less photogenic truth that this same disciplined withdrawal had been carefully planned and closely managed by an officer corps already fully aware, from Ludendorff's own private September admission this evening opened with, that the war was lost, precisely in order to preserve the army's own institutional pride and its own physical safety, rather than to disguise any genuine ongoing capacity to keep fighting a war its own high command had already privately abandoned. A drill hall in Kiel that still stands, mostly unremarked upon, in a city that has otherwise moved on. Notice briefly what remains today of the specific place where this whole 9-month story actually began, because Kiel's own relationship with its most consequential historical moment has remained, across the century since, considerably quieter than a comparable revolutionary landmark might expect to receive in a country with a longer or more comfortable tradition of celebrating its own revolutions. A modest memorial plaque and a small municipal monument mark the general area of the sailors' original uprising today, and the city holds occasional commemorative events around the anniversary each November. but Kiel has never developed anything resembling the scale of civic memory or national pilgrimage that, say, the storming of the Bastille receives in France or Independence Hall receives in the United States. A comparative quietness historians of German public memory have generally attributed to the same underlying discomfort this evening has already touched on. A revolution whose own ultimate outcome, a republic that lasted 14 years before handing power directly to the Nazi regime, has never sat easily within Germany's own post-war effort to build a usable, celebratory national historical memory, a nation considerably more practiced in the decades since 1945 at commemorating the crimes of its own worst chapter than at celebrating the achievements, however real and however hard won, of a revolution that came, in the end, to feel to a great many Germans less like a founding triumph, and more like an opportunity history did not ultimately allow to be fully realised. A newspaper office, a railway station, and a scattering of other small, stubborn pockets of Berlin that Bloody Week actually had to be fought over one building at a time. Consider, in rather more physical detail than this evening has offered so far, exactly where the January fighting this evening as already described actually took place, because the specific geography of Bloody Week reveals just how localised and how genuinely improvised the whole confrontation actually was, rather than the sweeping citywide battle its own dramatic name sometimes suggests to people encountering it for the first time. The Vorwärts building, home to the Social Democratic Party's own official newspaper, and, by a certain bitter irony, a building the revolutionary occupiers seized specifically because it represented Hebert's own moderate party, rather than because it held any particular strategic military value, was retaken by government troops on the 11th of January after an artillery bombardment that killed a number of the young, poorly armed occupiers inside, several of whom were shot after surrendering in a killing that a government inquiry later acknowledged with real embarrassment had violated the ordinary rules governing the treatment of prisoners. The Anhalter train station and a scattering of other railway and newspaper buildings across central Berlin saw similar smaller engagements across those same 6 days, each one taken individually, a fairly modest skirmish by the standards of the war that had only just ended, and each one taken together, adding up to the specific and cumulatively bloody total this evening as already named. A co-chairman shot on a Berlin street corner in a killing that history has mostly filed under simple madness, rather than under the same pattern as everything else. It is worth naming briefly one further assassination this evening has not yet had occasion to mention, because it touches directly on the same power-sharing council this evening described splitting apart over Christmas. Hugo Hess, the independent socialist co-chairman of the original Council of People's Deputies alongside Ebert, and a man who had spent the war years alongside Liebknecht as one of the small handful of German parliamentarians willing to openly oppose continued war funding, was shot on a Berlin street on the 8th of October 1919 by a man whose own stated motives, unlike the clearly organised political conspiracies behind the killings of Liebknecht, Luxemburg and later Erzberger, appear from the surviving court record to have been the product of a considerably more personal and considerably less coherent derangement, rather than any organised right-wing plot, Haas dying several weeks later from his own wounds, a death that nonetheless removed, within less than a year of the revolution's opening, yet another of its own most senior and most experienced figures from a political scene, already grown dangerously thin on leaders capable of bridging the gap between Ebert's moderate socialism and the considerably more radical currents Haas himself had spent his own career trying, with only partial success, to keep talking to one another rather than shooting at one another. 3 parties, uneasily sharing a coalition that briefly made the whole thing work. Consider, too, on the specific parliamentary coalition that actually governed Germany through the drafting of its own new constitution, because the so-called Weimar coalition, Ebert's own Social Democrats, the Catholic Centre Party, and the newly formed Liberal German Democratic Party represented on paper an alliance between 3 political traditions that had spent the whole of the preceding imperial era regarding one another with genuine and long-standing suspicion. socialists who had spent decades formally committed to the eventual abolition of private property, working alongside a centre party, built on Catholic social teaching and a considerable base of rural and provincial support, and a democratic party drawn largely from precisely the professional, commercial and academic middle class that had, for the whole of the empire's existence, regarded organised socialism as a genuine threat to its own way of life. That same coalition held together through 1919 with just enough shared commitment to building a stable parliamentary republic to actually complete the specific business of drafting and ratifying a constitution, before beginning, almost immediately afterward, the long process of fracturing into the fragmented, shifting multi-party landscape that would go on to make stable governing majorities so difficult to sustain for the whole of the following decade, a coalition, in other words, that proved just durable enough to build the house, and not, in the end, durable enough to keep living in it comfortably once the building itself was actually finished. A crown prince who quietly signed away his own claim to a throne his father had already lost. It is worth remembering briefly what became of Wilhelm's own eldest son, because his own considerably less dramatic post-war path offers one final small footnote to the whole story of the dynasty. This evening has spent so long describing losing power. Crown Prince Wilhelm, who had commanded German forces on the Western Front for much of the war, with a competence historians have generally judged rather more modest than his own official wartime propaganda suggested, followed his own father into exile, settling first on the Dutch island of Wieringen before eventually being permitted to return to Germany in 1923 under a formal renunciation of any future claim to the throne, and spent his own remaining years as a private citizen who nonetheless continued, across the 1920s and into the early years of Nazi rule, to nurture a quiet and ultimately entirely unfulfilled hope, one his own father shared from considerably further away at Dorn, that a restored Hohenzollern monarchy might yet emerge from whatever government eventually followed the fragile Weimar Republic, a hope that led him, in the Crown Prince's own case, to briefly and rather embarrassingly associate himself with Hitler's own movement in its earlier years, before the Nazi government made unmistakably clear, well before the decade was over, that it had no genuine intention of restoring the monarchy. It found considerably more useful as a defeated historical symbol than as any living rival for its own consolidated authority. An American reporter who arrived expecting to cover a defeated capital and found, instead, a city arguing with itself in real time. There is a specific outside witness worth pausing on here, because a handful of foreign correspondents happened to be stationed in Berlin across these same months, and left behind accounts that read, in places, considerably more vividly than the official German record of its own revolution ever quite manages to. The American journalist Ben Hecht, reporting for a Chicago newspaper and stationed in Berlin through much of this period, described a city that struck him less as a defeated capital in any conventional military sense than as an enormous, ongoing public argument. Cafes and street corners filled with Germans of every visible political persuasion, debating loudly and at length exactly what kind of country ought to replace the one that had just collapsed, a debate Hecht found himself genuinely struck by, for how little actual physical destruction accompanied it. Berlin's own buildings, unlike the shattered towns and cratered fields Hecht had already seen further west, along the former front lines, remaining almost entirely intact throughout the whole of the revolutionary period, a capital city tearing apart its own political structure from the inside, while its own physical fabric, the shop fronts, the streetcars, the grand government buildings along Wilhelmstrasse this evening has already had occasion to mention, remained standing largely untouched. It is worth placing that same street briefly on the map in your own mind, because Wilhelmstrasse, the row of government ministries running through the heart of Berlin, and the considerably grander boulevard of Unter den Linden running from the old royal palace toward the Brandenburg Gate, formed the actual physical stage on which very nearly every event this evening has described, Scheidemann's balcony speech, Liebknecht's rival proclamation, the Christmas fighting at the palace, the January occupations of nearby buildings actually played out, a compact stretch of central Berlin, walkable in well under an hour end to end. That meant the various competing centres of revolutionary and governmental authority this evening as described were never in the most literal physical sense, more than a short walk apart from one another. Crowds and couriers and rival proclamations moving between them across these same 9 months, with a speed and an intimacy that a considerably larger or more sprawling capital city might not have permitted. A war fought over factory jobs between returning soldiers and the women who had spent 4 years doing that same work in their absence. It is worth naming, honestly, one further and considerably less discussed dimension of the demobilisation crisis this evening as already described, because it complicates any simple story of returning soldiers finding an empty, welcoming labour market waiting for them. German women had, across the whole of the war, taken up factory positions in munitions plants, in transport, and in a great many other industries in numbers considerably larger than before 1914, filling exactly the jobs the 6 million mobilised men had vacated, and the same demobilisation decrees that brought those men flooding back into a shrunken post-war economy were, in a great many documented cases, accompanied by explicit government and trade union pressure to have women dismissed from those same positions, specifically to make room for returning veterans, a policy that a considerable number of the same social democratic and trade union officials this evening has already described, building the new republic's own institutions, supported with real enthusiasm, even as those same officials championed in the very same months the expanded political rights for women this evening has already described the new constitution, granting a genuine and rarely acknowledged contradiction, full citizenship at the ballot box arriving in the very same season as a mass, officially encouraged expulsion from the factory floor, that left a great many German working women experiencing the birth of their own new republic as something considerably more mixed than the simple story of expanding rights this evening has otherwise been glad to tell. 14 points promised, and rather fewer than 14 actually delivered. Notice plainly one further specific grievance that shaped German public reaction to the peace settlement, because it deserves to be weighed honestly alongside the war guilt clause this evening has already described. President Wilson's own 14 points, the broad set of principles he had announced in January of 1918, and that Max von Baden's government had explicitly invoked when first requesting an armistice, promised, among other things, a peace of reconciliation rather than punishment, and a right of national self-determination for the peoples affected by the war's territorial settlement, principles a great many ordinary Germans took seriously enough, in the autumn of 1918, to accept an armistice on the specific understanding that the eventual peace terms would be built around them, and the actual Treaty of Versailles that followed, denying Germany any real voice in its own drafting, assigning exclusive war guilt, and, in a detail German nationalist opinion found particularly bitter, prohibiting the union of Austria with Germany, despite an Austrian population that had voted in several regional plebiscites held immediately after the war, overwhelmingly in favour of exactly that same union, a principle of self-determination. The peace conference applied with real consistency to territories being carved away from Germany and considerably less consistency to the specific case of a German-speaking Austria that actually wanted to join it, struck a great many ordinary Germans considerably beyond the ranks of the nationalist right that would go on to exploit the sentiment most aggressively, as a peace secured through what felt to them like a fundamental broken promise. A grievance this evening will name honestly as having at least some real substance to it, even as the same honest accounting requires remembering that the government being asked to accept that broken promise was Ebert's fragile new republic, rather than the imperial establishment whose own decisions had actually produced the war in the first place. 100,000 men, and an officer corps that built, inside that small number, almost an entire state within the state. Consider, finally, the specific military institution that actually emerged from the wreckage of the old imperial army once the dust of revolution, civil conflict and peace treaty had all settled, because the Reichswehr, the new 100,000-man army, the Treaty of Versailles, permitted the Weimar Republic to maintain, inherited, almost entirely intact, the same aristocratic officer culture, the same institutional traditions, and, crucially, the same underlying scepticism toward the very parliamentary republic it now nominally served, that this evening has already described the Ebert-Groener Pact preserving back in November of 1918. The Reichswehr's own commanders spent the whole of the 1920s cultivating a considered political independence from the civilian government paying and nominally directing it, secretly circumventing several of the Versailles Treaty's own disarmament provisions through covert arrangements with the Soviet Union to develop and test weapons technology. Germany was formally forbidden from possessing and maintaining, across the whole of the Republic's existence, a genuinely and openly held institutional self-conception, expressed by more than one senior Reichswehr officer in surviving private correspondence, that the army's own loyalty belonged to the German nation considered as an abstract and enduring entity rather than to whichever particular constitutional government happened, at any given moment, to be sitting in Berlin, a distinction that would prove, in the Republic's final and most dangerous years, to matter considerably more than the specific 100,000-man troop ceiling the treaty's drafters had actually spent their own energy worrying about. A party that had split away from the mainstream in 1917 over the war, and split again in 1920 over what to actually do with the peace. It is worth following the Independent Social Democratic Party, the USPD, a little further than this evening has taken it so far, because its own eventual fate closes out one further thread left hanging since the Christmas crisis this evening has already described driving its ministers out of Weber's government. Having split from the mainstream Social Democrats back in 1917, specifically over continued wartime military funding, and having then split again from Hebert's own governing coalition after the Christmas fighting of 1918, the USPD spent 1919 and much of 1920 as Germany's single largest party of the genuine parliamentary left, standing somewhere between Ebert's cautious moderation and the Communist Party's revolutionary programme, winning, in the June 1920 Reichstag elections, a considerably larger share of the vote than the small, still recovering Communist Party managed on its own, before the party's own leadership, meeting at a congress in the city of Halle in October of 1920, split for a third and finally fatal time over the specific question of whether to join the Moscow-based Communist International this evening as already described being founded in 1919, a majority of delegates voting to affiliate and merge into the Communist Party outright, while a smaller remaining faction eventually drifted back into Ebert's own Social Democrats within another 2 years, a slow, three-part dissolution that left, by 1922, essentially none of the independent political space the USPD had originally been founded to occupy, its own considerable working-class following absorbed entirely into the same two poles, moderate parliamentary socialism and revolutionary communism, whose own inability to cooperate this whole evening has already described shaping nearly every major crisis of the revolution's own 9 formative months. Were the councils actually democratic, or simply the loudest room in the building? It is worth pausing, honestly, on a genuinely unresolved historical argument about the workers' and soldiers' councils themselves, because a considerable body of historical research conducted since has raised real and serious questions about exactly how representative these same councils, the institutions this evening has repeatedly described as the revolution's own foundational grassroots structure, actually were of the broader populations they claim to speak for. Council delegates were, in the great majority of documented cases, elected through mass open-air assemblies rather than through any secret or carefully administered ballot, a method that historians examining the process since have noted tended structurally and predictably to favour whichever faction could turn out the largest, loudest and most organised block of supporters on any given afternoon, often meaning politically experienced social democratic and, in some cities, independent socialist activists who had spent years building exactly this kind of organising capacity inside factories and army units, considerably more than it reflected any careful, deliberative sampling of the full range of political opinion actually held by the ordinary soldiers and workers those same councils claim to represent, none of which, this evening will say plainly, makes the council's own achievement forcing an unaccountable monarchy from power within days and compelling a reluctant government to grant genuine and lasting political reforms almost overnight any less real. But it does help explain something that otherwise looks, on its own surface, like a genuine puzzle, namely how a movement that spread with such overwhelming speed and such overwhelming apparent unanimity across an entire country in early November could, within barely 6 weeks, vote so decisively at its own December Congress to hand its own authority over to a considerably more conventional parliamentary system instead. A puzzle that resolves itself considerably once you account for the specific and rather more modest thing the councils actually were. Not a fully formed alternative system of government, representing some settled national consensus for permanent Soviet rule, but an improvised emergency structure, thrown together in a matter of days by ordinary people responding to an extraordinary and rapidly moving crisis that did the specific job it was actually needed for, ending a war and removing a monarchy considerably more successfully than it ever managed the rather larger and rather more contested job its own most committed radical members had hoped it might grow into performing. Coal had to keep moving and bread had to keep baking, no matter which balcony happened to be making proclamations that particular afternoon. It is worth remembering briefly one final and genuinely underappreciated thread running quietly underneath the whole of this dramatic 9 months, because a revolution, however total it might feel to the people living through its own most dramatic days, still requires an enormous amount of entirely unglamorous, unremarked upon labour to simply keep a modern industrial country from starving and freezing while its own political future remains unsettled. The railway administrators who kept coal trains actually running between the Ruhr Valley's mines and Berlin's own gasworks and bakeries, the postal clerks who kept mail and, crucially, the government's own communications moving between a fractured and often mutually hostile set of competing authorities, and the municipal officials in city after city who kept water treatment plants operating and street lamps lit through weeks of gunfire and general strikes, belonged, in the overwhelming majority of cases, to none of the factions this evening has spent so long describing arguing over the country's future, and simply kept doing, through the whole of the revolutionary period, the specific unglamorous administrative work that had to continue, regardless of whoever technically held political power in Berlin that particular week, a continuity of basic civil administration that historians examining the period have identified as one of the genuinely undertold reasons Germany's revolution, for all its own real violence, never actually descended into the kind of complete infrastructural collapse that considerably worsened Russia's own civil war during these same years. Ordinary bureaucrats and skilled workers, largely unnamed in any of the accounts this evening has drawn from, quietly keeping the lights on, in the most literal sense, while their own government argued, sometimes with words and sometimes with rifles, about what exactly it was going to become. Germany was not, that same November, the only empire discovering its own emperor could simply be told to leave. Consider, briefly, the considerably wider European stage this whole story was actually unfolding on, because it is easy, following one country's revolution in this much careful detail, to lose sight of just how many of Europe's other remaining empires were coming apart in almost exactly the same handful of weeks. Emperor Karl of Austria-Hungary, ruling an empire that this channel's own earlier evening on the Anglo-German rivalry has already described as a patchwork of 11 major linguistic and ethnic groups, held together chiefly by loyalty to his own person, issued a declaration renouncing participation in state affairs on the 11th of November 1918, the very same day Germany's own armistice took effect, a considerably more polite and considerably more ambiguous formula than outright abdication, one Karl himself would spend the following years insisting had never actually surrendered his own legal claim to either the Austrian or Hungarian thrones, even as the empire beneath him dissolved within that same single month into the independent successor states of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and a South Slav kingdom that would eventually become Yugoslavia, a collapse considerably more total and considerably more permanent in territorial terms than anything Germany itself experienced. Hungary's own path ran, if anything, even closer to the specific pattern this evening has spent so long tracing through Germany, a democratic revolution under the Count Mihaly Károlyi giving way, within months, to a considerably more radical Hungarian Soviet Republic declared by the communist Bela Kun in March of 1919, only weeks after the Bavarian Soviet Republic this evening has already described being crushed in Munich, a Hungarian council government that lasted somewhat longer than its Bavarian counterpart, holding power for some 4 months before being overthrown, in August of 1919, by an invading Romanian army and a domestic counter-revolutionary movement under Admiral Miklos Horthy, whose own methods, a wave of retaliatory killings historians have come to call the White Terror, made even the bloodiest of Germany's own Freikorps or reprisals look, by grim comparison, almost restrained. A reminder that the specific German sequence this evening has walked through in such careful detail — mutiny, councils, moderate government, radical uprising, brutal suppression — was not some uniquely German pathology at all, but one particular, and in several important respects comparatively less catastrophic, instance of a pattern playing out across very nearly the whole of Central Europe in the same 18-month window as 4 ancient land empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and further east Ottoman, all came apart within barely 2 years of one another, each one discovering, in its own particular way, that a monarchy's authority, however permanent it had always seemed to the people living inside it, could simply stop being obeyed once enough of its own soldiers and citizens quietly decided it no longer deserved to be. A count with a private diary, who happened to be walking through Berlin streets on very nearly every day that actually mattered. Notice, finally, one further and genuinely invaluable source this evening has drawn on for some of its own more specific street-level detail, because Count Harry Kessler, a cosmopolitan diplomat, art patron, and inveterate diarist who spent the whole of the revolutionary period living in Berlin, kept a daily journal recording, in extraordinarily specific detail, the mood of the crowds, the content of overheard conversations, and his own private assessment of nearly every major figure this evening as described, from Eberta Liebknecht to the Freikorps officers he encountered directly in the January fighting, a diary published only decades later and prized by historians since precisely because Kessler, unlike nearly every other major source this evening has already named as carrying its own considerable self-interested bias, had no particular political faction's reputation to defend and no career to protect, by shading his own account in any single direction, recording, with what reads today as a rare and genuinely candid even-handedness, both the exhilaration and the confusion he witnessed in Berlin streets, and the genuine brutality he personally observed soldiers inflicting on captured Spartacist prisoners during Bloody Week. A document historians have come to treat as one of the single most reliable eyewitness accounts of the whole 9-month revolution, precisely because its own author never needed the story to come out any particular way. 5 words carved into stone above a dome, finished 2 years before the empire that commissioned them fell. It is worth closing this particular thread with one small architectural detail, worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures, in a single carved inscription, an irony neither the craftsman who carved it nor the emperor who reluctantly approved it could possibly have anticipated. The Reichstag building, completed in 1894 to house the Imperial Parliament this evening, has already described operating with real but genuinely limited authority under the Empire's own constitution, had its own famous dedication inscription to the German people, added above its main entrance only in 1916, in the middle of the war, over Wilhelm's own personal and long-standing objection, since he had spent years resisting any inscription implying the building, and by extension the government inside it, answered to the German people rather than to their emperor, an objection finally overruled by wartime political necessity, the government needing by 1916 every possible gesture of unity it could offer an increasingly exhausted public, and it is worth sitting, briefly, with the plain fact that the same building whose own facade had only just been made to formally acknowledge the German people as its ultimate audience would, within barely 2 years of that same inscription's unveiling, watch precisely those same German people gather beneath it in their hundreds of thousands to proclaim from one of its own windows the exact republic the inscription's carved words had been so reluctantly made to gesture toward all along, a rumour about a disguise that never actually happened, spreading faster than the far stranger truth actually did. It is worth naming, honestly, one small piece of dishonest storytelling from these same weeks this evening is not going to let stand unchallenged, because it illustrates how quickly a genuinely strange true story can still get outpaced by an even stranger invented one. Rumours circulated widely, both inside Germany and in the foreign press covering the collapse of the German monarchy, that Wilhelm had fled across the Dutch border disguised as a woman, or alternatively dressed as a common soldier to avoid recognition. Colourful variations that appeared in a number of contemporary newspaper accounts and that have continued to surface, in slightly different forms, in popular retellings ever since, and that are, on the full documentary record historians have since assembled from Dutch border officials, German military escorts, and Wilhelm's own travelling companions, simply untrue, Wilhelm having crossed into Holland in his own ordinary military uniform, in his own imperial train, with his own name given openly to the customs official this evening has already described relieving him of his ceremonial sword, a mundane truth that nonetheless struggled, for decades afterward, to compete with a considerably more theatrical invention that fit rather too neatly the story. A great many people on every side of the political divide already wanted to believe about a humiliated emperor's final flight. A satirist with a pen considerably sharper than Kollwitz's own grieving pencil. Consider, too, alongside Käthe Kollwitz's own grief-stricken art this evening has already described, the considerably angrier artistic response the same period produced in the work of the Berlin satirist Georg Gross, a veteran of the war's own early years discharged for a nervous breakdown, who spent the revolutionary period and the years immediately following it producing savage, grotesquely exaggerated drawings and paintings depicting profiteering businessmen, brutal Freikorps officers, and corrupt, complacent officer class this evening, has already described surviving the revolution with its own institutions essentially intact. Work published widely in left-wing German magazines and collected in 1920 into a portfolio that led to Gross himself being prosecuted more than once across the following decade on charges of insulting the German army and the German Republic's own institutions alike. A body of art that stands, alongside Kollwitz's own quieter mourning, as a second and considerably more combative artistic record of exactly how unresolved and how genuinely angry a great many ordinary Germans remained about the specific compromises this whole evening has described the revolution settling for, and anger Gross's own pen recorded with a bitterness the official political history of the period, told only through cabinet meetings and constitutional clauses, would otherwise leave almost entirely out of the picture. A January cold that made the fighting itself considerably more miserable than any of the surviving photographs quite managed to convey. Picture, finally, the specific and rather ordinary physical misery running underneath the whole of Bloody Week's own dramatic violence, because surviving accounts from soldiers and Freikorps volunteers on both sides describe a Berlin January of genuinely bitter cold, men fighting from behind hastily assembled barricades and through unheated buildings with numb hands and frozen boots, artillery crews working guns whose own metal grew cold enough to burn exposed skin, and civilians in the surrounding streets rationing what little coal remained to them while gunfire echoed a few blocks away. A physical discomfort that receives, in the great majority of accounts this evening has drawn from, only the briefest passing mention, crowded out by the considerably more dramatic business of proclamations and casualty counts, but one worth sitting with honestly for a moment nonetheless, because it is a useful reminder that every single event this long night has described however large it has since grown in the history books, was actually lived through by cold, tired, frightened people, rather than by the tidy historical abstractions their own later chroniclers have necessarily had to reduce them to. A revolution that happened almost entirely in cities, while a great deal of rural Germany simply waited to see how it would turn out. It is worth remembering, honestly, one further imbalance running through nearly everything this evening is described, because the German Revolution, for all its own dramatic sweep across Kiel and Berlin and Munich and a dozen cities in between, remained, at its core, an overwhelmingly urban and industrial phenomenon, and a great deal of rural Germany, the small farming villages and provincial estates that still made up a considerable share of the country's own population, and, in the east particularly, remained under the direct economic authority of the same aristocratic Junker landowning class this evening, has already described dominating the old army's own officer corps, experienced these same 9 months considerably more as distant news reaching them through newspapers and returning soldiers than as any direct upheaval in their own daily lives. Rural conservatives, considerably slower to organise politically in the revolution's earliest weeks than the industrial workers and mutinous sailors who had done the actual work of bringing the monarchy down, would go on, once the National Assembly elections arrived, to provide a durable and considerably more sceptical electoral base for exactly the nationalist, anti-republican political currents this evening has already described the Freikorps and eventually the Nazi movement drawing on. A rural, urban divide that meant the revolution's own most enthusiastic supporters and the revolution's own most persistent long-term opponents often lived, quite literally, in entirely different kinds of German communities that barely encountered one another's daily experience of these same 9 months at all. Men who came home from Russian captivity considerably later than everyone else, carrying ideas their own government found genuinely alarming. It is worth naming too one further and often overlooked source feeding both extremes of the political spectrum this evening has spent so long describing, because German prisoners of war held in Russia, in some cases for several years, continued trickling back into Germany not in the first weeks after the armistice alongside the 6 million men this evening as already described, but considerably later, across 1919 and even into 1920, delayed by the chaos of the ongoing Russian Civil War and by the sheer logistical difficulty of moving hundreds of thousands of men across a continent still very much at war with itself in its own eastern reaches. A number of these same returning prisoners came back having witnessed the Russian Revolution directly and at length from inside Russian territory, some radicalised toward exactly the Bolshevik sympathies that fed the Communist Party's own growing membership across 1919 and 1920, and others, by contrast, returning with a genuine and hardened horror at the violence and disorder they had personally witnessed accompanying Russia's own revolutionary transformation, an experience that pushed a considerable number of these same returning men directly into the ranks of the most fiercely anti-communist Freikorps units, meaning the single shared experience of years spent as a prisoner in revolutionary Russia produced, among the men who actually lived through it, two entirely opposite political conclusions, each one convinced with equal and genuine conviction that its own experience proved definitively what Germany itself needed to avoid. A funeral procession that turned a single afternoon of grief into a considerably angrier and considerably more radical Munich than the murdered man himself had ever actually led. It is worth returning briefly to Kurt Eisner's own death, because the specific public reaction to his funeral did as much as any single subsequent decision to actually radicalise the Bavarian Revolution beyond the considerably gentler, more idealistic government Eisner himself had led. Eisner's funeral, held in Munich in the last days of February 1919, drew a crowd historians estimate at well over 100,000 mourners, a procession that moved through the city for hours behind a coffin carried, in a detail contemporary accounts specifically remark on, past crowds weeping openly in the street for a man whose own 8-day interim government, this evening as already described, had accomplished rather more in symbolic gesture than in actual policy. And it was this same enormous wave of public grief and public anger at his own assassination by a young aristocratic nationalist rather than any careful ideological argument that swept the considerably more radical government of the following weeks. First, the coffeehouse idealists, and then Levino's own harder communist administration, into power on a tide of genuine popular fury that Eisner's own murderer had, with a bitter and entirely unintended irony, done more to create than to prevent, officers from the old aristocracy commanding foot soldiers who had, in a great many cases, grown up in exactly the kind of working-class household the revolution itself claimed to speak for. Notice, plainly, one final asymmetry running through the whole of the Freikorps story this evening has spent so long describing, because it complicates any simple picture of a uniformly aristocratic counter-revolution crushing a uniformly working-class uprising. The great majority of Freikorps officers, men like Luttwitz and the commanders of the Erhard Brigade this evening has already named, came from precisely the same Prussian aristocratic and professional officer class that had run the old Imperial Army, but the ordinary volunteers filling the ranks beneath them, the young men actually doing the marching, the shooting, and, in the case of Liebknecht's and Landauer's own killings, the beating, were drawn overwhelmingly from considerably more modest backgrounds, unemployed veterans, displaced clerks, and demobilised working-class soldiers who had, in a great many individual cases, grown up in households not so very different from the sailors and factory workers on the opposite side of the very barricades they were now storming. A reminder worth sitting with, honestly, alongside everything this evening has already said about class and violence in this story, that the revolution's own bloodiest confrontations were, in a great many cases, fought between men who might, under almost any other circumstance, have found considerably more in common with one another than either side's own officers or leaders ever really wanted them to notice. An 8-hour working day, agreed quietly between industrialists and union leaders in a Berlin hotel room, while the rest of the country was still watching balconies. Consider, plainly, one further and genuinely durable achievement of these same 9 months that this evening has not yet given its own proper due, because it happened almost entirely out of public view, and yet outlasted, in practical effect on ordinary German lives, very nearly everything else this evening has described. On the 15th of November 1918, only 6 days after Scheidemann's own balcony proclamation, representatives of Germany's major industrial employers, led by the industrialist Hugo Stinnes, and representatives of the country's major trade unions, led by the union official Karl Legien, meeting privately and with remarkably little of the drama surrounding the political events unfolding elsewhere in Berlin that same week, signed an agreement that industrialists had refused, for decades, to seriously consider under the Empire, formally recognising trade unions as legitimate bargaining partners for the first time in German history and establishing an 8-hour working day across German industry, a reform labour movements across Europe had been demanding for generations, and that arrived in Germany, in the end, not through any parliamentary vote or any street uprising at all, but through a quiet private negotiation between exactly the kind of industrialists and union bosses who had spent the whole of the preceding imperial era treating one another as natural enemies, driven to the table by a shared and entirely practical fear that failing to reach some accommodation might hand the country's factories over to the considerably more radical workers' councils instead. It is worth naming, honestly, that this same agreement, quiet and almost bureaucratic as its own signing actually was, did more to materially improve the daily lives of millions of ordinary German workers than any of the far more dramatic street confrontations this evening has spent so long describing, a shortened working day and formally recognised union bargaining rights that held, with only modest erosion, for the whole of the Republic's 14 years, and that stand, alongside the expansion of the vote to women this evening has already named, as one of the genuine and lasting social achievements this revolution actually produced, a reminder worth holding on to as this long night finally approaches its own close, that a revolution's own truest and most durable legacy sometimes arrives, not from the balcony everyone was watching that particular afternoon, but from a considerably quieter room, a few streets away, where two men who had spent years distrusting each other finally agreed, out of nothing more romantic than shared necessity, to actually sign something. A shortened working day that reached the factory floor considerably faster than it ever reached the kitchen or the field. It is worth remembering too, honestly, exactly whom that same quiet November agreement between Stinnes and Legion actually left out, because a full accounting of it requires the same fairness this evening has already tried to apply to everything else. The 8-hour day and the new bargaining rights negotiated that same week applied, in practice, chiefly to industrial workers in large factories, precisely the organised, unionised workforce Legion's own movement represented, and reached considerably more slowly, if at all, the domestic servants, agricultural labourers, and small workshop employees, disproportionately women and disproportionately rural, whose own labour sat outside the specific industrial sectors the agreement actually covered, meaning one of the revolution's own most celebrated concrete achievements arrived, like so much else this evening has described, unevenly, its own benefits flowing first and most completely to the same organised urban industrial working class that had done the most visible work of bringing the revolution about in the first place, a model of labour partnership that a reunified Germany still, in its own quieter way, keeps running today. Notice, briefly, one final present-day thread before this long night turns fully toward its own close, because the basic principle Stinnes and Legion agreed to in that Berlin hotel room in November of 1918, organised labour and organised industry sitting down together as formally recognised partners rather than as simple adversaries, survived considerably longer than either the Weimar Republic or the men who signed it, re-emerging after the Second World War as the foundation of the co-determination system, Mitbestimmung, that still gives German workers formal, legally guaranteed representation on the supervisory boards of the country's largest companies today. A modern German economic institution that traces its own philosophical lineage back, in a quiet and rarely remembered line, to a single hurried wartime bargain struck in the same chaotic week. A mutiny in Kiel was still finishing the work of bringing an empire down. A republic that eventually built its own private army to defend a flag the real army had never much cared for. It is worth naming briefly one further and rather telling development that grew directly out of everything this evening has described, because it shows that the Republic's own defenders eventually recognised, if considerably later than might have helped, exactly how precarious the Ebert-Groener bargain had actually left them. In 1924, 4 years after the Kapp-Putsch this evening has already described the Reichswehr declining to resist, Social Democrats and other Republican-minded parties organised the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, a mass paramilitary organisation named directly for the Republic's own contested flag colours, and built explicitly to provide the constitutional government with an organised force of its own loyal defenders, drawn from war veterans, trade unionists and ordinary citizens willing to march, drill, and, if genuinely necessary, fight in the Republic's own defence. A belated recognition that a government whose only reliable instrument of physical force remained an army openly sceptical of its own legitimacy could not indefinitely depend on general strikes alone to survive its next serious challenge. The Reichsbanner grew, across the following decade, into an organisation claiming millions of members and fought, in the Republic's final and most desperate years, a losing street-level battle against paramilitary organisations considerably better armed and, crucially, considerably more willing to use lethal force without restraint, most prominently the Nazi movement's own Storm Detachment, a defeat that closed in the early 1930s, the same basic contest this whole long night has described opening in a Kiel drill hall in November of 1918, moderate Republican Germany, organised and genuinely committed but institutionally outgunned from the very first bargain its own founders struck, against a considerably harder and considerably more ruthless current that had never, at any single point across the whole of the intervening 15 years, actually stopped fighting for the chance to finish what the Freikorps had started, an admiral's idea of honour and a sailor's idea of it, turning out, in the end, to have never actually meant the same thing at all. Consider, one final time before this long night gathers itself for its own close, the specific and rather simple human disagreement sitting underneath every single grander political event this evening has described, because it is easy, after several hours spent following telephone calls and constitutional clauses, to lose track of how plainly this whole revolution actually began. A group of admirals in Wilhelmshaven in the last days of October 1918 believed, with what appears from their own surviving orders to have been genuine and unironic sincerity, that a fleet's honour was worth more than the lives of the ordinary men who crewed it, that dying in one final pointless battle mattered more than living to see whatever came next. A group of sailors in Kiel, only days later, decided, with a clarity that cost several of them their own lives in the demonstration this evening has already described being fired on, that this was simply not true, that their own lives were worth more than an abstraction. Their own commanders had never once asked them to help define, and it is this same small, stubborn, and in the end entirely reasonable disagreement, considerably more than any of the ideological language later layered on top of it, socialism, monarchism, Bolshevism, republicanism, that this whole evening's long story actually grew out of. An empire's authority coming apart not because a nation suddenly discovered some grand new political philosophy overnight, but because several thousand tired, hungry, frightened men in a Baltic port finally said, out loud and to each other, the plain and simple thing a great many of their own countrymen had apparently been quietly thinking for rather longer than anyone in charge of them had cared to notice. Dock workers in London and Glasgow, reading about a mutiny in Kiel and thinking, rather more than their own governments would have liked, that it sounded familiar. Consider, briefly, one further international thread this evening has not yet properly drawn out, because official Allied diplomacy was never the only lens through which people beyond Germany's own borders watched this revolution unfold. British and French trade unions and socialist newspapers, considerably more sympathetic to the ordinary German sailors and workers driving the revolution than their own government's own wartime propaganda had spent 4 years training them to be, followed events in Kiel and Berlin with real and openly expressed solidarity, a handful of British dock workers in the very same period refusing to load ships carrying munitions intended for use against the Bolshevik government in Russia, a wave of labour sympathy that briefly connected in the minds of a great many ordinary British and French workers exhausted by their own 4 years of sacrifice, the German sailors refusing one more pointless battle at Kiel with their own considerably more widespread post-war exhaustion with continued military adventures anywhere at all. A rare instance, worth noting honestly, in which working people on the very sides that had just spent 4 years trying to kill one another found, within weeks of the fighting actually stopping, considerably more in common with each other's own exhaustion and each other's own hunger than either side's official wartime rhetoric had ever allowed either public to imagine. Walking back through the whole of it, once more, before we let it go, it is worth gathering up now in a single unhurried pass the whole shape of the story this night has walked you through, because a night this long deserves one last look at how all its own separate pieces actually fit together. It began with a fleet ordered to sea for a battle nobody who actually had to fight it could see any remaining purpose in, and with sailors at Kiel who discovered almost by accident that refusing a single order could bring an entire empire's authority crumbling down within days. It moved through a wave of workers' and soldiers' councils spreading across Germany faster than any government could respond to them, through a single Berlin afternoon in which 2 balconies barely a mile apart proclaimed 2 entirely different countries within 2 hours of each other, and through an emperor who learned of his own deposition from a wire service report reaching him hours late at a headquarters 200 miles from the events actually deciding his fate. It built, alongside all of this, a private bargain between a socialist chancellor and an imperial general that purchased short-term order at the cost of leaving an old army's power almost entirely intact. A bargain that would go on to matter considerably more in the Republic's final years than nearly anyone striking it in November of 1918 could have possibly anticipated. It walked through a Christmas Eve shelling of a royal palace over unpaid wages, through a January uprising crushed by paramilitary volunteers who despised the Republic they had just been hired to save, through the murder of two of the revolution's own most serious thinkers by men who faced, in the end, almost no real consequence for it, and through a small provincial theatre town that lent its own borrowed name to a republic it never actually governed from. And it closed, finally, with a coup that the army would not lift a finger to stop, and a general strike that stopped it anyway, followed within weeks by that same government turning its own restored authority against precisely the workers who had just saved it, a closing asymmetry that this evening has asked you to sit with rather than resolve, because it is, in its own quiet way, the truest single summary available of everything the revolution actually was and everything it never quite managed to become. And it is worth remembering in this same final gathering up that alongside every one of those failures and compromises sat one quiet, durable success. An 8-hour working day agreed in a hotel room during the very same week. An emperor fled to Holland, a right to vote that reached German women for the first time in the country's history, and years later, a republic finally organising its own citizens to march in defence of a flag its own army had never much respected. Evidence enough that even a revolution remembered, on balance, as unfinished business still managed to leave behind a few things sturdy enough to actually last. A fire that reached a house nobody had checked the wiring of in years. It is worth naming, one final time, the plain and rather sobering image this whole long story keeps circling back toward, because it is easy. Telling a story this dense with telephone calls and balconies and constitutional clauses, to lose sight of the considerably simpler thing actually driving it. An empire that had gone 4 years without anyone in genuine authority telling its own exhausted, hungry population the truth about how badly the war was actually going caught fire in the first days of November 1918, not because any single match was struck with any particular skill or any particular malice, but because the whole structure had already been left, by neglect and by 4 years of unexamined strain, in a condition where almost any spark, a cancelled naval operation, an arrested sailor, a rumour travelling by train from one city to the next was always going to be enough. The fire spread exactly the way fires spread through buildings nobody has properly maintained, faster in some rooms than the people trying to contain it ever expected, and it burned out in Kiel and in most of Germany within days, while in Berlin and in Munich it kept smouldering for months longer, flaring back up in January and again in the spring and once more, considerably closer to the whole structure's own foundations, in March of 1920, and what the men gathered at Weimar actually built, in the weeks after the worst of that same fire had been put out, was not a new house at all, but a hurried and in places genuinely ingenious repair job laid directly over scorched and still warm timber, a repair that held, more or less, for 14 years, before the same underlying wiring, never fully replaced, never fully inspected, caught again in the 1930s, and burned considerably more of the world down than the first fire ever had. It is worth naming gently that Wilhelm himself, settling at dawn in the days and weeks after his own abdication, into the same long exile this channel's own earlier evening on the Anglo-German rivalry has already described in full, never once, by any surviving account, seemed to grasp that the empire he lost had been undone less by any conspiracy of disloyal civilians than by his own 4 years of leaving an exhausted country's own wiring unchecked, while he and his generals kept insisting, right up until the final possible week, that the house was in no danger at all, and it is worth letting that same thought settle quietly rather than heavily as you drift the rest of the way towards sleep, not as any grand lesson about empires in particular, but as a small and considerably more ordinary reminder that the things we leave unexamined for too long, out of exhaustion or out of pride or simply out of the hope that nobody will notice, have a way of eventually choosing their own moment to be noticed, usually at the worst possible hour, and usually by people who never actually wanted to be the ones lighting the match in the first place. Before we let this long night finally close, take a quiet moment if you have not already, to like this video and subscribe, but only if this channel has genuinely earned a small place in your own evenings, because that is the only reason worth doing it at all. And if you would like to give this still small channel a hand along its own slow climb toward 10,000 subscribers, tonight is as good a night as any to do it, since a small channel growing one quiet subscriber at a time is not so very different, in its own modest way, from the small assemblies and councils this whole evening has spent so long describing, each one mattering rather more in the end than it might have seemed to at the time. If you are watching this on YouTube, the Spotify link for this channel is waiting for you down in the description, since these stories find their way there too these days, often before anywhere else. And if you are listening on Spotify tonight instead, simply search Historian at Midnight on YouTube to find the rest of what this channel has quietly been building, one long story at a time. And if you feel like it, leave your own location and your own local time down in the comments below, a small thing that costs you nothing, and that helps some other tired, restless stranger, somewhere else entirely on this same turning planet, find their own way into this same slow unspooling of an old and complicated story. Let whatever is left of tonight's tension finally drain out through your own shoulders, down through the mattress or the cushion or the chair beneath you, and out into whatever quiet, ordinary room you are actually lying in right now, because nothing in this story, however large it once was to the sailors and chancellors and generals who lived inside it, needs to weigh on you any longer than it takes to fall asleep. The Emperor is long gone. The drill hall at Kiel, where a handful of exhausted sailors first refused an order, stands quietly today in a city that has rebuilt itself many times over since, and whatever fear or pride or exhaustion once seemed large enough to bring an entire empire down, has long since settled into nothing more than old paper in quiet archives, and a single wreath laid every January beside a canal in Berlin. Close your eyes now, all the way, if you have not already, and let the rest of this old story simply finish itself somewhere behind you, in the dark. Good night, and sweet dreams.